Hi guys, before you drift off tonight, let me tell you a story that might sound stranger than fiction, but is entirely rooted in the dusty pages of real human history. Imagine a world where everything smells slightly of smoke, earth, and sweat. The kind of place where silence is broken not by traffic or phones, but by the rustle of wool clothing, the creak of wooden carts, and the occasional distant church bell. In this world, the idea of romance, of intimacy, of what we today might call sex, is both central and absolutely hidden beneath layers of fear, control, religion, and survival. That world is the medieval world. Now, you might think you know what the Middle Ages were like: castles, kings, knights, plagues, but when it comes to everyday life and especially intimacy, things become both unexpectedly simple and deeply bizarre. Let's begin in the 12th century, in a small village tucked somewhere in what we now call France. The houses are made of timber frames packed with a mixture of clay, straw, and dung. There are no glass windows, no privacy, and almost no personal space. Families sleep together on piles of hay or thin, straw-stuffed mattresses. Chickens roam freely in the single shared room. People rarely bathe, and when they do, it's often in cold streams or in wooden tubs filled once a month if you're lucky. Now, imagine trying to have a moment of passion in that space. Your parents are 2 feet away. Your younger siblings are snoring in the same bed. The dog is curled up at your feet. Privacy isn't just rare, it's non-existent. And yet, people still fall in love. Or at least they try to. Marriage during this time is a strange thing. In most parts of Europe, the church is beginning to take over the institution. But for many villagers, a marriage is simply 2 people saying vows in front of witnesses. That's it. No church, no priest, no rings. Just a promise. And once that promise is made, the expectation is that the couple will, how shall we say this gently, consummate the union. But here's where it gets even more curious. The church, while encouraging marriage, is terrified of desire. Passion is considered dangerous, pleasure sinful. Sex is only for reproduction, and even then, only in certain positions at certain times, and never on Sundays or holy days, which, by the way, make up a huge portion of the calendar. There were actual lists, long, serious lists of forbidden days for sex. No intimacy during Lent. None during Advent. No sex while a woman is menstruating, pregnant, or nursing. No sex before communion. And if you happened to be a peasant who worked from sunup to sundown, the only time you had the energy left for anything was probably on a forbidden day. Still, people found ways. Sometimes in the woods, sometimes in the barn, and yes, even in the fields behind haystacks, while the oxen waited patiently nearby. They didn't have romantic candlelight dinners, but they did have mead, and sometimes ale. And when the village held a feast, perhaps after a harvest or for a local saint's day, that's when things could get interesting. There were dances, clumsy, loud, joyful dances. Music played on fiddles and drums. People wore their best clothes, which still smelled faintly of smoke and sweat, but it didn't matter. Because for a few hours they could forget the looming winter, the threat of wolves, the taxes, the hunger, and just be human. And yes, there were trysts, secret meetings, whispered promises behind stables, maybe even love, but also consequences. Because if a woman became pregnant outside of marriage, the punishment could be harsh. Fines, public shame. In some towns, she would be made to walk through the streets with her hair unbound, a symbol of disgrace. And for the men, usually a fine, sometimes nothing at all. But not all of medieval society lived like this. In castles, behind stone walls, things were slightly different. Let's step away from the village now and walk up a long, winding path to a fortified manor, where a noblewoman named Alice sits in her chamber. She's about 17, already considered of marriageable age. Her long hair is braided tightly. She wears linen under a woolen gown. Her fingers play nervously with a ribbon, because today, she's supposed to meet her betrothed. She's never met him. Her father arranged the match months ago. He's 35, twice her age. He owns land, horses, a vineyard. She owns a dowry. No one asks Alice how she feels. No one tells her what to expect. On her wedding night, a midwife might wait outside the door to confirm the deed was done. sometimes even checking the sheets. That's how important virginity was. To ensure it, some families kept their daughters locked indoors. Some forced them to wear chastity belts. Not the metal torture devices you see in movies, but actual fabric or leather contraptions, often more symbolic than functional. And yet, even here in the castle, desire found a way. Troubadours sang of courtly love, a forbidden, poetic affection that existed outside marriage. A knight might carry a lady's ribbon into battle, dreaming of her while fighting. But if they were caught, well, punishment could be severe. Adultery could mean exile, or worse. But let's pause here, because the medieval world wasn't just about fear and punishment. It was also about adaptation, about survival, about finding moments of humanity in the middle of chaos. Even the most devout priest might offer advice in the confessional, how to make marriage work, how to handle temptation. One 13th century manual warned men not to treat their wives too roughly, while another offered shockingly detailed instructions for avoiding sin during intercourse, including which positions were too beastly. Yes, really, these weren't modern books. These were serious theological texts, written by monks, copied by hand, passed from abbey to abbey. And while all this was happening, peasants still had to wake up with the sun, feed their pigs, tend the fields, mend their tools, and find moments, brief, stolen moments for laughter, for closeness, for connection, and yes, for love. Even if the church frowned upon it, even if privacy was a fantasy, even if the hay itched terribly, because deep down, medieval people weren't so different from us. They dreamed, they longed, they reached for each other in the dark. And in the next part of the story, we'll go deeper into the strange world of medieval medicine and its curious ideas about the body, desire, and what really caused those mysterious urges. Those mysterious urges that seemed to rise from nowhere. Well, medieval scholars had plenty of explanations for them, none of which would make sense today, but all of which were believed with quiet, unquestioning certainty. Let's start with the four humors. According to medieval medicine, the human body was ruled by four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These weren't just substances. They were believed to govern your mood, your health, your personality, and yes, even your desires. If someone was overly passionate, they were said to have too much blood, what they called a sanguine nature. Too dry and you were melancholic. Too moist and you might be sluggish, slow, or overly lustful. The balance of these fluids determined everything from how easily you got angry to how frequently you, well, thought about things you weren't supposed to think about. Monks wrote entire manuals about how food affected the humors. Spices, for instance, were considered dangerous. Nutmeg, cinnamon, even garlic. All were believed to stir the blood and heat the body, which is why, in monasteries, meals were often bland, boiled, and intentionally dull. On the other hand, if you were a wealthy noble, spices were a status symbol. You could afford saffron, cloves, pepper, flavors from the east, carried overland on the backs of camels and in the holds of creaking ships. So the irony was this: the poor were pure because their diets were bland, while the rich were believed to be more prone to sin, simply because their food tasted better. And speaking of monks, they had their own struggles. Celibacy was the rule, but not always the reality. In some monasteries, records show that confessions were filled with desperate admissions of guilt. Fleshly temptations, dreams, accidental thoughts, even accidental movements during sleep. They tried everything to resist: cold baths, flagellation, silence. Some even wore shirts made of coarse hair, designed to irritate the skin and keep the mind from wandering. But the human mind is tricky. The more you tell it not to think of something, the louder that something becomes. And so, despite all the sermons, all the prayers, and all the cold stone walls, desire still crept in. Now, let's walk away from the monastery and back into the village. It's a quiet spring morning. The air smells of damp soil. In the fields, children chase each other while sheep graze nearby. But in one cottage, a young woman named Edith sits beside her grandmother, who is whispering ancient words. These aren't church words. These are old words. Folk wisdom, herbs, roots, remedies. Because while the church tried to control everything, The knowledge of women midwives, herbalists, wise women existed in a parallel world. They knew what herbs to use to ease childbirth, to end pain, and sometimes to prevent it from happening at all. There were potions brewed from pennyroyal, tansy, and rue, plants believed to cause the body to reject pregnancy. Were they safe? Often not, but they were used, quietly, secretly, because sometimes a woman simply couldn't afford another mouth to feed. And in the eyes of the church, that was a grave sin. But in the eyes of Edith, it was survival. Meanwhile, men had their own advice books. One manuscript, written in the 13th century, warned that too much intimacy made a man weak. It drained the spirit. And yet, it also claimed that regular activity, in moderation, kept a man's eyesight strong and his complexion clear. Yes, seriously. Medieval logic could bend in strange ways. And when problems arose, when a man couldn't perform or a woman couldn't conceive, they turned to cures that seem almost laughable now. One recipe instructed a man to roast a wolf's liver, grind it into powder, and mix it with wine. Another advised placing a roasted frog under the bed. Some recommended amulets made from hawk feathers or owl bones. All of it spoken in hushed tones, passed between friends, hidden from priests. But let's not forget the role of the church in all of this, because while priests condemned lust, they also obsessed over it. There were entire confession manuals written to help clergy question sinners in shocking detail. Pages upon pages instructing priests how to ask about everything from thoughts to actions to dreams. One manual even instructed confessors to ask if the penitent had sinned with beasts. Yes, that was an actual category. But don't worry, we won't go down that path. Instead, let's return to the village square, where a group of traveling performers has just arrived. They bring music, puppets, laughter, and sometimes crude jokes. Jokes about marriage, about men who can't satisfy their wives, about women who take lovers when their husbands are away. The crowd laughs. Even the priest, standing at the edge, can't help but smile. Because even in a world of rules, people crave release. Not just of the body, but of the spirit. And these stories, these moments, they remind us that life in the Middle Ages wasn't all about suffering and sin. It was also about stories told under the stars. Shared laughter, quiet touches, longing looks across a crowded church pew. It was about being human. And in our next chapter, we'll explore how marriage evolved in this strange world. How it became not just a sacred act, but a political tool, a survival strategy, and sometimes a cage. A cage that often looked like a home, with a wooden roof, a warm fire, and two people bound not by love, but by survival. Because in the medieval world, marriage wasn't just a union between two hearts. It was an alliance between families, an exchange of property, a strategy. For nobles, it meant power. For peasants, it meant land, food, and the promise of help during winter. Love, that was a luxury. Among the aristocracy, children were often married off before they had learned to read or write. A girl might be promised to a boy before either of them knew what it meant. The wedding itself could be held when the bride was 12, or even younger in some cases, though cohabitation might wait until puberty. But not always. And so, the weight of adulthood fell early. In villages, things were different, slightly. People usually married in their late teens or early 20s, often to someone they had known since childhood. But even then, choice was limited. If a girl was an only child, her father might guard her fiercely, because her body, her virginity, was directly tied to the family's honor. And if she lost that before marriage, willingly or not, her value, at least in the eyes of society, dropped like a stone into a well. Men, of course, were judged differently. They were expected to sow their oats, as the saying would later go. In many towns, brothels were not only tolerated, they were regulated. In some cities, the local authorities inspected the women for disease and even set prices. Yes, there were price lists. A woman with blonde hair? Worth more. Younger? Worth more. More exotic? Worth even more. And yet, these women, called public women or filles de joie, were often victims of circumstance. Some were orphans. Others had fled abusive households. Many had no other way to survive. They lived on the edge of society. Feared, desired, shamed, but needed. In London, the Bishop of Winchester even ran several brothels. The women were known as Winchester geese, and they worked under the church's blind eye, just outside the city limits. If one of them died, she couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. Instead, she was laid to rest in unmarked fields known as crossbones. And yet, even they found moments of laughter, friendships, sisterhood, songs hummed by candlelight, because no matter the label, wife, mistress, courtesan, widow, women in the Middle Ages lived in a world that tried to define them, but never fully succeeded. Take, for example, the laws of droit du seigneur. You may have heard the myth that lords had the right to sleep with a peasant's bride on her wedding night. While there's no solid proof that this was widely practiced, the fear of it was real. The rumor alone was enough to remind people who held the power. Even without such rights, noblemen often took liberties. Their positions made them untouchable. A peasant girl could be forced, bribed, or threatened into silence. If she became pregnant, she bore the shame. The noblemen simply moved on. But let's turn to something quieter, something softer. Picture a woman sitting by a fire. She's spinning wool, the wheel creaking gently. Her husband has gone to town for market day. The children are asleep. And in the flickering shadows, she unfolds a letter. Not from her husband, but from someone else. A man she met once during a festival. They danced beneath the lanterns. He gave her a ribbon, said nothing more, but later a letter arrived. Handwritten, clumsy but heartfelt. She hides it beneath the mattress, reads it at night. Just words, but enough to stir the coals in her chest. This too was part of medieval love. Not grand declarations, but tiny rebellions. Secret feelings. Letters passed beneath bread loaves. Glances held a second too long during Mass. And it wasn't just women. Men too longed for connection, for beauty, for meaning. One knight wrote a poem to a lady whose name he never learned. He saw her once in a garden, and for 20 years, he carried the memory like a shield into battle. Love in the Middle Ages could be painful, silent, impossibly distant, but it could also be powerful. And yet, so much of it existed beneath layers of control. The church dictated not only when and how people could marry, but what they could feel. Priests warned against dancing too closely, against touching during feasts, against laughter that lingered too long between unmarried people. And for those who didn't fit into the expected mold, those who felt attraction differently or not at all, life was dangerous. Men accused of loving other men were punished brutally, whipped, imprisoned, or worse. Women were rarely punished directly, but they were erased, dismissed, ignored. The world was built on binaries, man and woman, husband and wife, right and wrong. And anything outside that was labeled heresy. But even heresy couldn't stop nature, because people still dreamed, still desired, still found one another in haylofts, forests, meadows, and candlelit corners, still whispered names into the night, long after the fires had gone out. And in the next part of this journey, we'll dive deeper into those hidden places, into the world of birth, of pain, of motherhood, and the untold burden women carried in silence. Into the world of birth, of pain, of motherhood, and the untold burden women carried in silence, we now step. Giving birth in the Middle Ages was not a moment of joyful celebration surrounded by doctors and clean sheets. It was a dangerous journey into the unknown, often made with only a midwife, a handful of old cloths, and whispered prayers to saints. Most women gave birth at home, on straw-covered floors, or in small wooden birthing chairs with a hole in the middle. There were no sterile tools, no anesthesia, no guarantee of survival. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, iron, and fear. When a woman began labor, she was surrounded by other women, neighbors, relatives, experienced midwives. Men were kept outside. The door might be marked with a cross or a string of herbs to keep away evil spirits. Candles were lit, not just for light, but to guide the soul of the child into the world. And if things went wrong, which they often did, there was very little that could be done. One chronicler wrote of a woman who labored for 3 days before dying with the child still inside her. The midwife, desperate and shaking, carved a crude cross into the wooden beams above the bed and wept into her hands. Because every birth was a gamble. Even when successful, the aftermath could be grueling. Infection, fever, and bleeding claimed countless women in the days following childbirth. They called it childbed fever, though they didn't understand the cause. It was simply a risk one accepted. And yet, despite the fear and pain, life went on. The baby, if healthy, would be quickly baptized, often within hours. The church taught that unbaptized infants who died would not go to heaven, so even weak or sickly babies were rushed to the nearest priest, sometimes in the middle of the night, carried in the arms of a trembling aunt or neighbor. Mothers who survived were expected to return to work quickly. There was no rest, no maternity leave, no gentle recovery. She had pigs to feed, bread to bake, fields to help sow. She might carry the baby on her back as she worked, wrapped in linen and wool, soothed by the rhythm of her footsteps. As the child grew, so did the pressure. A mother had to teach obedience, manners, prayer. If the child was a boy, he might one day work the land, or if lucky, be sent to learn a trade. If a girl, she would be taught to spin, to cook, to prepare for her own marriage, which would likely come too early. Still, there were moments of tenderness. A lullaby sung in the twilight. A carved wooden doll handed down from sister to sister. A crust of bread shared under a tree on a hot day. Children in the Middle Ages were not always viewed the way we see them now. They were seen as incomplete adults, fragile, foolish, in need of strict guidance. And yet they laughed. They played. They chased geese through muddy streets and told stories in the haylofts. But not all children made it. Infant mortality was high. Disease, hunger, accidents, so many things could end a young life in an instant. And when that happened, grief came quietly. There was no therapy, no support groups. A mother might weep alone in the fields, her cries muffled by the wind. A father might carve a symbol into the barn wall and never speak the name again. And yet they kept going, because they had to. Meanwhile, in noble households, childbirth came with its own complications. A noblewoman was expected to produce heirs, especially sons. Her worth was measured in bloodlines and legacies. She might be confined to her chambers weeks before birth, her meals brought by servants, her windows covered to block bad air. Amulets were hung above the bed. Holy relics were placed under pillows. If a difficult labor was expected, a priest might be summoned to bless the room or hear confession, just in case. Sometimes surgeons were called, men with crude tools and little knowledge. Their presence was a last resort. If they were needed, it usually meant someone would not survive. But when a boy was born, the bells rang. Gifts were given. Feasts held. When a girl was born, there was polite silence. A nod, a soft sigh, perhaps next time. And what of women who bore children out of wedlock? They were often cast out, scorned, forced to live on the edge of society. Some were sent to convents. Others wandered from town to town, begging with a baby in their arms, shunned and pitted in equal measure. But life is never entirely cruel. Some towns had quiet corners of kindness. Old women who took in such mothers, sharing what little they had. Midwives who didn't ask questions. Priests who looked the other way, because even in an age ruled by rules, compassion still flickered. And motherhood was only one part of a woman's life. When the children were grown, if she lived long enough, she became the elder, the one who knew the stories, the herbs, the secrets of the body. She was the one younger women turned to in quiet desperation, the one who remembered births and deaths, floods and harvests, kindnesses and betrayals. She held the memory of the village in her bones. And in the next part of the story, we'll step back into the lives of men, exploring their rites of passage, their fears, their battles, and the strange journey from boyhood to manhood in a world shaped by war, faith, and duty. The strange journey from boyhood to manhood in the Middle Ages was not marked by gentle transitions or reflective pauses, but by abrupt expectations, quiet pressure, and rituals that carved responsibility into young shoulders long before the body or mind was ready. For the peasant boy, The path was as narrow as the muddy footpaths he walked each morning, barefoot and shivering in the damp fog of dawn. From as young as 6 or 7, he was expected to help, whether it meant chasing birds from the crops, feeding the animals, or carrying buckets of water from a distant well. There was no gentle schooling, no books waiting on a desk, no carefully designed lessons in self-discovery. He learned by watching his father, by mimicking his older brothers, and by being corrected with sharp words or, if needed, a heavier hand. In his world, strength mattered more than cleverness. To be a man meant to endure, to carry weight without complaint, to obey without hesitation. And yet, beneath the hardened exterior that boys were taught to build, there existed deep undercurrents of fear of hunger, of failure, of being seen as weak. There were moments, of course, when childhood peeked through the cracks. A stolen game with friends in the fields, a wooden sword carved from a broken fence post, a race against the wind. But those moments were brief, fragile, and often interrupted by a barked command or the sharp clang of a bell calling hands back to work. For those born into nobility, the journey was no easier, only different in shape. A young noble boy might be taken from his mother at the age of 7 and sent to another lord's household to serve as a page. It was there, among unfamiliar faces and cold stone walls, that he began his training, not only in swordplay and horsemanship, but in obedience, courtesy, and the art of holding silence in the presence of power. He polished armor not his own, fetched wine he would not drink, and bowed to men who measured his worth by the steadiness of his hand and the sharpness of his gaze. If he proved himself capable, he might become a squire, assisting a knight, learning to handle weapons, ride with precision, and withstand pain without flinching. Bruises were common, bleeding expected, and tears unwelcome. And when the time came, if the stars aligned and his master approved, he would kneel before his lord, or perhaps even a king, and rise as a knight sworn to protect the weak, serve the church, and fight with honor, though in practice, survival often took precedence over principle. War was not a distant idea in the Middle Ages, it was a frequent and looming threat. Battles could erupt over land, honor, or insult. Peasants were conscripted, often given little more than a spear and a prayer, and marched to face men they did not know for reasons they barely understood. And for those too poor or young to fight, there was still blood. Were left villages burned, fields trampled, food stolen. It brought soldiers into homes, demanded shelter, and often took far more than it gave. But even in peacetime, violence lingered. Disputes were settled with fists, blades, or in some cases, through trial by combat, where guilt or innocence was determined not by truth, but by the outcome of a fight. Honor, especially for men, was currency. To be dishonored was to lose everything, and so they clung to reputation, sometimes more tightly than to life itself. In taverns, men drank heavily, not only to forget the pain in their backs or the emptiness in their bellies, but also to prove themselves, to show that they could handle it, that they were strong, unmoved, immune. They boasted, shouted, sometimes sang. And when words failed, fists took over. Yet not all expressions of manhood were loud. There were men who tended bees, spoke gently to animals, carved small toys for their children, or sat in silence beside their wives, hands rough but movements careful. There were fathers who feared for their daughters, who wept quietly when sons went to war, who mended broken roofs with shaking fingers not because they wanted to, but because no one else would. And then there were men who became monks, not out of piety alone, but sometimes to escape the crushing weight of expectation, the burden of inheritance, the violence that seemed to chase them through every season of life. In the cloistered halls of monasteries, these men lived by the ringing of bells, the turning of pages, the repetition of chants. They worked the gardens, copied texts, tended the sick, and tried, however imperfectly, to find peace. But even there, thoughts crept in, regrets, desires, memories, because no wall, however thick, can fully block out the echo of a life once lived. And so, across the medieval world, the concept of manhood twisted and shifted, shaped by birth, by faith, by land, and by fear. To be a man was to endure, yes, but also to carry unspoken grief, to make choices without knowledge, to be held accountable for outcomes far beyond one's control. And in our next chapter, we'll explore the undercurrent beneath all of this, the deep entanglement between power, faith, and guilt, and how confession, punishment, and forgiveness became central pillars in the strange architecture of the medieval soul. The concept of marriage in the Middle Ages might seem simple at first glance. A man and a woman brought together, often through arrangement, often without choice. But underneath the structure lay an entire system of social contracts, spiritual expectations, and physical realities that shaped how intimacy was experienced and understood. A marriage was rarely about love, even more rarely about attraction. It was a bond of property, of status, of legacy. A nobleman might marry a girl of 12 not because of desire, but because her family owned fertile land bordering his own, and because she came with a dowry of livestock and silver chalices passed down through generations. The church allowed it. Consent, as we understand it today, wasn't the centerpiece. And yet, within the closed doors of manor houses and peasant cottages alike, human nature did not pause for institutions. While we imagine grand castles and candlelit chambers, the average home was far more modest. For most, a single-room hut served as sleeping quarters, kitchen, and sometimes stable all in one. A family might sleep in the same bed, or side by side on straw-stuffed mattresses, separated only by thin cloth or not at all. Privacy, that fragile thread upon which desire often hangs, was a luxury few could afford. Children saw everything. Elders heard everything. The scent of a shared hearth mingled with the scent of sweat and livestock, creating an atmosphere far removed from the romantic notions later penned by Victorian novelists. And yet, intimacy was not absent. It was quieter, shaped by necessity and rhythm, by planting and harvest, by feast days and fasts. There were rules, so many rules. The church dictated that intercourse should only occur within marriage and only for the purpose of procreation. But confessions tell us otherwise. Priests recorded the sins of their flock, sins whispered behind wooden screens. A stable boy seduced by a merchant's wife, a nun tormented by dreams of her childhood love, a husband drunk and unable to perform, a wife who sought comfort in the arms of another while her man marched off to war. These stories, scattered like grains of wheat across dusty records, give us glimpses of real people grappling with temptation, shame, longing. And the punishments were often cruel. A woman caught in adultery might have her head shaved or be forced to parade through town in nothing but a shift, mocked by children and scorned by those who once called her sister. Men fared little better. Whipping, exile, loss of land, sin carried weight, and reputation could not be easily repaired once tarnished. Yet sin, like hunger, returned again and again. The laws were clear, but enforcement wavered. A powerful lord might go unpunished for taking liberties with his servant, while a lowly baker could lose his livelihood for a single indiscretion. Beneath all this, knowledge about the body was muddled. Many believed in the humors, that bodily fluids governed health and temperament, that too much passion could overheat the blood, that women were colder by nature and thus less lustful, though midwives often whispered the opposite. Medical texts spoke in riddles and metaphors, referencing ancient Greeks more than observable fact. The female body, in particular, was a mystery. Some believed that a woman had to orgasm to conceive. Others thought that staring at a bright moon could make her pregnant. Amulets were worn, potions brewed, prayers muttered at shrines, all in pursuit of fertility, or its prevention. But not all unions were sanctioned. There were brothels in every town, tolerated if not encouraged by authorities who taxed them. They bore names like the Bishop's Delight or the Red House, and their workers, often orphans, widows, or girls sold by desperate parents, led lives full of danger and transience. Yet within these walls, knowledge passed silently from woman to woman, a kind of education never written down. They learned what pleased men, what frightened them, how to manipulate desire for survival. Some found power there, fleeting but real. Others were broken, even outside the cities, far from the watchful eyes of clergy and councilmen. Rural life fostered its own rhythms. Festivals often blurred the lines of decorum. On May Day, young men and women danced around poles adorned with flowers, sometimes slipping away into forests where no priest watched. These moments of joy, of freedom, reminded them of a life before obligation, before arrangement, before vows spoken in Latin neither truly understood. And behind closed doors, when candles were snuffed and hearths went cold, lovers whispered not of theology or punishment, but of touch, of longing, of secrets held between bodies pressed together against the world. While nobility and clergy debated the nature of morality, and peasants toiled in the fields, beneath the daily grind of life in the medieval world, human desires continued to pulse quietly yet powerfully through society, shaping behaviors, decisions, and even the laws of the time, though often hidden under cloaks of modesty or religious fervor that only partially obscured what truly went on behind closed wooden doors. The daily routine of ordinary people, especially in small rural communities, often revolved around agricultural cycles, religious observances, and the changing seasons, but woven into these rhythms were also the more private customs of courtship, family planning, and intimate relations, all of which were governed not only by tradition but also by superstition, hearsay, and the peculiar advice of the village midwife or local priest. Meals, modest though they were, became moments of shared intimacy, and the structure of medieval homes, often consisting of just one room where everyone slept, cooked, and lived together, meant that privacy was rare, and so much of what today is considered deeply personal was once openly witnessed, or at least heard, by others. Even the act of childbirth, a deeply communal and at times sacred event, took place in full view of other women from the village who came not only to assist but to chant prayers, offer herbal mixtures, and pass along stories and advice steeped in centuries of accumulated wisdom, some of which was practical and some entirely mythical. The belief, for instance, that a child born under a full moon would be more lustful in adulthood was a common refrain, and one that informed how couples timed their intimacy, just as planting was timed according to lunar phases and weather omens. There was also the enduring belief in certain foods as aphrodisiacs. Onions, leeks, and even almonds were consumed not merely for taste or sustenance, but for their supposed power to stir the blood and inflame desire, especially when paired with wine, which was often spiced with cloves or cinnamon to heighten the effect, although such indulgence was generally reserved for the wealthier classes or for festivals and special nights, such as the Eve of St. Agnes, which young women believed was the perfect time to dream of their future husbands, provided they fasted all day and slept with a sprig of rosemary under their pillow. The concept of love in the medieval mind was a complicated affair, less about passion and more about alliance, land, and the continuation of bloodlines, especially among the nobility, who often married in their early teens with little to no knowledge of their future spouse beyond what their families negotiated on parchment sealed with wax and witnessed by the church. For peasants, there was sometimes more freedom to choose one's partner, but even then the match had to be approved by the lord of the manor or the village priest, and it was common for couples to be publicly interrogated to ensure they weren't too closely related by blood or had previously been betrothed to others, since such entanglements could bring not only scandal but ecclesiastical penalties. Despite the heavy hand of the church, there existed an underground current of folk beliefs and informal practices that allowed for a certain flexibility in romantic and sexual arrangements. In some villages, a tradition known as handfasting functioned as a sort of trial marriage, in which a couple would commit to each other for a year and a day, living together as though married, and at the end of that period could choose to formalize the union through the church or go their separate ways without legal consequence, although such customs were more tolerated in the Celtic regions and among pagan communities lingering on the fringes of Christian Europe. Of course, not all relationships were formed by consent. Servant girls, especially in the households of wealthy landowners, were vulnerable to exploitation, and while some chroniclers of the time tried to portray noble lords as paragons of virtue, personal letters, court records, and even ecclesiastical complaints paint a different picture, one in which abuses of power were widespread, though rarely punished unless they crossed certain political lines. The distinction between seduction and coercion was often blurred, and the burden of proof always fell upon the woman, who, if pregnant out of wedlock, faced public penance, social exclusion, or in some regions, forced pilgrimage to atone for what was perceived as a moral failing regardless of how the child was conceived. Yet there were moments of tenderness and genuine connection, especially in long-term marriages among peasants, where partners had little choice but to rely on each other for survival, sharing not only work and hardship but also laughter, stories, and the raising of children, often under the roof where their own parents had once done the same. They told tales by the fire, sang old songs on winter nights, and carved little love tokens, wooden hearts or flower symbols, to leave under pillows or tie to a beloved's apron. It was in these quiet, unrecorded corners of history that the truest forms of affection may have existed, not in the grand halls of kings or the sanctuaries of cathedrals, but in the humble homes of those whose names never made it into any book. And while the church tried its best to regulate the bedroom through edicts and confessions, declaring that intimacy was only acceptable within marriage and only for the purpose of procreation, people continued to find ways to express desire and affection beyond these rigid bounds, often with a wink and a whispered joke, or through coded gestures that only a lover would understand. A glance across a field, a song hummed during chores, or a hand brushing another's in the market could carry more meaning than any sermon. Even punishments for so-called moral crimes were inconsistent and, at times, bizarre. In one recorded case from 13th century England, a man accused of adultery was made to walk barefoot through town carrying a heavy stone while reciting penitential psalms. Yet a similar offense committed by a nobleman resulted in nothing more than a charitable donation to a local monastery, suggesting once again that class, as much as faith, shaped the experience of right and wrong. And in all of this, the rules, the exceptions, the rituals, and the rebellions, the medieval world reveals itself not as a place of uniform repression or ignorance, but as a complex, breathing society where human longing persisted despite every effort to tame or suppress it, leaving behind only faint echoes in records, artifacts, and the bones of castles where whispered secrets once slipped through cracks in cold stone walls. In the smoky warmth of a peasant's cottage, where the fire rarely died out and the scent of charred wood clung to every timber beam, the day began not with a rooster's crow, but with the heavy rustling of rough linen blankets and the creaking of straw-stuffed mattresses as bodies stirred from shared beds. In medieval villages, it wasn't uncommon for an entire family to sleep in one room, sometimes even on a single large bed. Children nestled beside parents, a dog or two curled near their feet, and sometimes a visiting relative snoring from a stool near the hearth. Privacy was not a concept that truly existed in the same way we understand it today, and modesty was an evolving thing, shaped less by rules and more by necessity. As the sunlight crept through the slatted shutters and danced across the smoke-darkened walls, people rose to meet another day of work and routine, shaped by the natural rhythms of the season. The first tasks of the morning involved fetching water from the nearest well or stream, a chore that could take up a large portion of one's energy before the sun even fully rose. Women would gather in groups with wooden buckets balanced on their hips or suspended from yokes across their shoulders, chatting in hushed tones about neighbors, local gossip, and the irregularities of the moon that might affect childbirth or crop yields. Men, already moving about the fields or tending to livestock, exchanged brief greetings, often focused on weather and whether it might turn foul. In towns, the mornings were louder, blacksmiths hammering iron into shape, vendors arranging stale loaves and withered vegetables on their carts, and apprentices sweeping straw from stone floors in narrow, winding alleyways. The streets smelled of mud, dung, and boiled meat. Most people rarely bathed, and when they did, it was either in rivers or communal bathhouses, which served a dual purpose. As places for hygiene, yes, but also for socializing, matchmaking, and in many cases, discreet encounters of a more intimate nature. The bathhouses of medieval Europe were fascinating in their contradictions. In some towns, particularly before the spread of the plague and later the rise of puritanical religious fervor, bathhouses were tolerated and even celebrated for the role they played in urban life. They were warm, steamy, and relaxing, decorated with murals or simple tapestries, with wooden benches placed beside steaming tubs. People of both sexes often bathed together, separated not always by gender but sometimes by class. A merchant might soak in a heated tub while being scrubbed by an attendant, discussing trade deals or local taxes, while across the room, a servant might hastily wash his feet and arms before being shooed away to make room for someone more important. These bathhouses were not only centers of hygiene, but also places where intimacy was quietly exchanged. Many towns had what were known as stews, a term that came to imply a bathhouse that also offered sexual services. Though often frowned upon by the church, these establishments persisted and even flourished in certain cities, protected by guilds or, in some cases, the silent approval of local officials who benefited from the income they brought in. A man might enter for a bath and leave with a smile, his coins lighter and his secrets sealed behind the thick steam of the room. But what of marriage? What of the unions that formed the bedrock of medieval society, both in peasant cottages and noble halls? The truth is that marriage in the Middle Ages was often less about love and more about property, alliances, and survival. Among the lower classes, marriage could be as simple as a spoken agreement witnessed by the community and sealed with a shared meal. There were no rings, no white dresses, no grand celebrations unless the village decided it was a good excuse to drink and sing. But even then, the act of declaring oneself bound to another could take place in a field, outside a church, or by a stream under the eyes of friends. For nobles, however, marriage was a political act, a carefully arranged affair that sometimes involved girls as young as 12 being promised to much older men in exchange for land, soldiers, or a seat at court. The girl's opinion was often irrelevant, and love, if it existed at all, came only much later, if ever. Dowries were exchanged like currency. Contracts were written with ink made from gall nuts and signed under the eyes of priests who blessed the union in Latin before returning to their own celibate lives, though even that was sometimes more theoretical than true. Yet, within these arranged marriages, moments of tenderness were not impossible. A noblewoman might, over time, find affection for her husband, just as he might discover a deep respect for her intelligence or her ability to manage a household. Letters from the period reveal touching sentiments, moments of longing, and even playful teasing, suggesting that not all was cold and duty-bound. Some husbands wrote to their wives with genuine affection, addressing them as "my joy" or "the light of my house," while others penned instructions for managing estates, perhaps followed by a short line asking after the health of their children. Children, after all, were the goal. Bearing heirs was the duty of every wife, particularly among the noble class, and women often bore child after child until their bodies gave out or the midwife shook her head. Midwives were essential figures, part herbalist, part counselor, part surgeon, and their knowledge was passed down through whispered instruction rather than formal training. They understood which herbs could encourage labor, which poultices reduced fever, and which prayers might soothe a frightened mother during the dangerous hours of childbirth. In a world without painkillers, anesthesia, or sterile tools, birth was both miracle and gamble, a doorway between life and death walked in silence, sweat, and blood. And while sex within marriage was expected and often frequent, it was also subject to rules, both spoken and unspoken. The church declared specific days when intercourse was forbidden: Lent, Advent, Fridays, Sundays, feast days, fast days, and more, which left shockingly few days for unimpeded intimacy. Even on acceptable days, couples were instructed to avoid it for pleasure alone, to perform it in the missionary position, and to never speak of it openly. But of course, people were people, and the gap between rule and reality was as wide then as it is now. So what did people desire? What did they fantasize about when the candles were out and the doors were closed? That, too, is a question with answers hidden in letters, illustrations, poetry, and confessions. Fragments of longing left behind like fingerprints in the dust. Those fingerprints in the dust become clearer when we read the margins of manuscripts, the carvings hidden under choir stalls, the sly lyrics of drinking songs, and the legal records that accidentally preserved the private missteps of ordinary people whose names would otherwise have dissolved into time. Because while the official record of the Middle Ages tried to present a world ordered by kings, priests, and doctrine, the unofficial record, scrawled by bored scribes, whispered by traveling minstrels, stitched into bed hangings, scratched into tavern beams, shows a society far more curious, playful, embarrassed, and inventive about intimacy than sermons alone would suggest. If you leaf through a devotional book copied in a monastic scriptorium, you might expect only saints and sacred text. Yet turn a page and in the margin a tiny rabbit in a hooded cloak chases a monk with a stick shaped suspiciously like something not mentioned in the Rule of St. Benedict. The joke is crude, yes, but its presence in a holy book tells us that even in places where chastity was sworn and fasting enforced, the imagination refused to be fenced in by vows. Cathedral misericords, those little folding seats where clergy rested during long services, sometimes bare carvings of lovers tangled under foliage, women wielding frying pans against lecherous men, or hybrid beasts engaged in antics that made congregants smirk during matins. Sacred space and earthy humor coexisted without the universe collapsing. Literature added yet another layer. Courtly love poetry, polished and highborn, spoke in metaphors of wounds, fire, captivity, and surrender, allowing desire to slip past censorship under the cover of allegory. Meanwhile, the fabliaux, short, rowdy tales from France and beyond, dispensed with subtlety and delivered body scenes of priests tricked, husbands cuckolded, wives plotting bedroom reversals, all narrated with grinning delight to audiences who knew full well that virtue and practice rarely aligned. Andreas Capellanus wrote of the laws of love at court, ranking kisses, favors, and glances as though intimacy could be weighed like silver. Village storytellers, less formal, judged success by laughter and ale spilled on the floor. Confession manuals tried to catalog sin with exhausting precision, asking parish priests to inquire not only whether a married couple engaged at forbidden times but whether intention, posture, or imagined company intensified the fault. The very act of drafting such questions widened the mental space in which the faithful might wander. In response, laypeople developed strategies. Vague answers, selective memory, tokens paid in coin or grain, and in some cases the strategic timing of confession after a fast day when certain activities were, technically, impossible to have occurred, at least according to the calendar cited aloud. Material culture carried signals too subtle for written rules. Laces tied a certain way on a sleeve could hint that a young woman was not yet promised. A ribbon of a particular color, tucked through a man's belt during a feast, might declare interest. Embroidered pomegranates, figs, or open lilies on bed linens suggested fertility hopes in newly married households. Painted shutters showing paired birds signaled that the occupants were wed, while shutters scraped bare by weather sometimes marked a home of widowhood, cautioning suitors to tread carefully. Sumptuary laws tried to control fabrics and furs by class rank, yet by restricting velvets and imported silks to nobles they accidentally eroticized those materials, so that touching them, legally or not, carried a thrill of social trespass layered atop any personal attraction. Medical speculation traveled in market gossip. Some healers insisted that male desire gathered in the loins like steam in a sealed kettle and had to be vented or it would rise to the brain and cause madness. Others warned that women who did not release seed would suffer a wandering womb that pressed against the lungs and caused choking sobs mistaken for demonic possession. To counter such imagined urgencies, apothecaries sold powders ground from stag antler, dried fish bladder, or roasted div hearts. Midwives brewed teas from fennel, yarrow, and pennyroyal to delay conception, though doses misjudged could sicken or kill. Charms combining scripture with scrap metal amulets were knotted to belts and hidden beneath shifts in hopes of protecting fertility or preventing it according to need. Urban archives preserve cases where neighbors testified through thin walls. One record from a market town describes a dispute over rent that spiraled into moral accusation when a landlord claimed his tenants entertained visitors after Compline. Witnesses did not agree on what they heard. Some swore it was singing, others insisted on rhythmic furniture noise, but the court transcript, written in cramped Latin, leaves us the cadence of daily life better than any polished chronicle. Another file recounts a marriage contested because the couple had exchanged vows in a field without witnesses, later living together as husband and wife. When inheritance became an issue, relatives argued that the union was invalid, yet the woman produced a wool cord knotted in 2 places, saying the knots marked their pledge. The court debated for weeks, proving that memory and material tokens could stand where paperwork did not. Pilgrimage added layers of sanctioned mobility that sometimes blurred moral lines. A husband and wife walking to a shrine might meet travelers from distant lands, share lodging in crowded hostels, exchange relic badges, and discover new customs regarding modesty. Some returned with stories of regions where women wore looser veils or wherein's provided mixed sleeping lofts, stories that, retold, challenged local norms. Not all pilgrim encounters were pious. Complaints survive of trysts along routes to Compostela and Rome, shielded by the excuse of devotional travel and the anonymity of distance. When plague struck in the 14th century, shattering families and emptying streets, attitudes toward the body shifted again. Some communities tightened moral enforcement, arguing that disease was divine punishment and therefore abstinence and fasting must increase. Others, facing mortality daily, plunged into cycles of indulgence, feasting, and hurried unions formed out of grief, loneliness, or the desperate desire to create life in a world of relentless death. Birth spikes after major mortality waves suggest that fear and longing often walked hand in hand. Amid all of this, art continued to encode what could not be preached. Stained glass occasionally showed Adam and Eve with leaves positioned with theatrical care. Tapestries commissioned for noble bridal chambers mingled hunting scenes with fertility symbols. Pilgrimage badges shaped like anatomical parts. Breasts, phalluses, wombs were traded half in jest, half in hope, pinned beneath outer garments where only lovers might see them during undressing. Taken together, these scattered traces remind us that medieval sexuality was not a flat landscape patrolled by uniform rules, but a woven tapestry of law, faith, folk practice, humor, fear, and stubborn human tenderness. People bent rules without always breaking them, wrapped longing in metaphor, hid knowledge in herbs and embroidery, confessed selectively, loved imperfectly, and left behind just enough evidence for us to follow their shadows across parchment, wood, cloth, and stone. In the next part, we will move from symbols and suggestion into the surprisingly structured world of regulation. Guild oversight of brothels, municipal fines for public indecency, clerical visitations, medical screening for disease in licensed districts, and the moral economies that formed wherever desire, profit, and authority met in the cramped streets of medieval towns. In medieval towns where stone walls rose like silent sentinels over narrow, winding streets, the presence of brothels was as much a part of daily life as the market stalls or the tolling of church bells. These establishments, though officially condemned by the church, operated within a paradoxical framework where sin was taxed, regulated, and at times tacitly protected by civic authorities who understood the practical necessity of controlling desire rather than eradicating it. The brothel, often known by euphemistic names such as stews, banyo, or the Red House, functioned as a complex institution balancing on the knife edge between morality and pragmatism, offering a sanctioned outlet for lust that, it was believed, might otherwise lead to greater social chaos, including adultery, assault, or the spread of disease. In cities like London, Paris, or Florence, these places were clustered in specific quarters, sometimes near riverbanks or outside city gates, where their presence could be more easily monitored and contained. Local governments issued licenses to madams who managed the houses, collecting fees and ensuring a degree of order while also enforcing strict rules. Clients had to pay at the door, prostitutes were required to undergo regular medical examinations, and brothels were forbidden to operate on certain religious feast days or during Lent. This system of oversight reflected a pragmatic understanding of human nature, a tacit acknowledgement that while the church preached chastity, the realities of flesh and society necessitated compromise. Yet these were not merely dens of sin. Within their walls existed a social microcosm where women, often from desperate circumstances, wielded a peculiar form of power, negotiating prices, managing clients, and forming networks of support that sometimes rivaled those of the guilds dominating legitimate trades. Some madams accumulated wealth, and a few women rose in status enough to buy their freedom or open their own establishments. The brothel became a place where social roles blurred, where the boundaries between victim and entrepreneur, sinner and survivor, were fluid and contested. The tension between control and freedom extended into the streets themselves, where public behavior was carefully policed. Town ordinances frequently prescribed fines, public humiliation, or corporal punishment for acts deemed indecent. Kissing in public, drunkenness leading to lewdness, or even excessive flirtation could result in a night spent in the stocks or a whipping. In some cases, the entire community was called upon to enforce moral conduct, with neighbors reporting one another to magistrates or clergy, driven by genuine piety, envy, or personal grievance. Such vigilance created a culture where desire was both feared and fervently lived in secret. Clerical authorities wielded confession as both a spiritual and social tool, requiring penitents to disclose intimate details of their lives under threat of eternal damnation. Confessors became unwitting psychologists, gathering knowledge about forbidden acts, fantasies, and betrayals, often imposing penances that ranged from prayer and fasting to public acts of contrition like wearing a white sheet or carrying a candle in procession. The church's obsession with regulating sex extended to its insistence on specific postures and prohibitions against unnatural acts, reflecting a worldview where the body was a battleground for the soul. Meanwhile, medical authorities, though primitive by modern standards, began to recognize the spread of diseases linked to sexual activity, leading to early forms of health regulation. In some regions, prostitutes had to present themselves for inspection, and health certificates were issued, a precursor to modern public health efforts. Cities with large populations and transient visitors faced the constant challenge of balancing moral authority with public welfare, a tension that shaped urban governance for centuries. The economic dimension of sexuality in medieval towns was vast and layered. Brothels contributed to city coffers through taxation. Cloth merchants supplied the luxurious fabrics favored by high-status courtesans. Apothecaries sold potions promising fertility or virility, and taverns provided spaces where courtship and negotiation blended with drinking and gambling. In such spaces, desire was commodified, ritualized, and performed as both necessity and entertainment. Yet beneath all regulations and economic interests lay the human reality of vulnerability, loneliness, and longing. Many women in the trade faced brutal conditions, social stigma, and health risks. Many clients wrestled with shame and the fear of exposure. Still, human connection, fleeting, transactional, or profound, persisted amid the shadows and candlelight, creating a social fabric as complex as any woven in cathedral tapestries. In the next part, we will explore how disease, particularly the infamous plagues, altered perceptions of sexuality, intimacy, and community, transforming medieval attitudes and practices in ways both subtle and catastrophic. The shadow of disease loomed over medieval Europe like an unrelenting specter, influencing every aspect of life, including the intimate bonds shared between individuals. While everyday hardships such as hunger and war were familiar to most, nothing disrupted the social fabric and personal relationships more profoundly than the relentless waves of plague that swept across towns and countrysides alike. These outbreaks not only decimated populations but also reshaped how people viewed the body, sexuality, and the very nature of human connection. Fear became a constant companion, whispering warnings in every corner, turning once vibrant gatherings into cautious, restrained affairs, and casting suspicion even upon the closest of companions. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, arrived with a swiftness and brutality that shattered communities. Entire villages were emptied overnight. Families were torn apart by grief and isolation. In the midst of this devastation, the role of sexuality became fraught with contradictions. On one hand, the desperate desire to reproduce, to replenish what had been lost, drove some to seek solace in intimacy, clinging to hope amid despair. On the other hand, the very act of closeness was now viewed through a lens of danger, as physical contact risked spreading an invisible killer. People were torn between the need for comfort and the instinct for self-preservation. Religious authorities interpreted the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins, emphasizing abstinence and penitence as the path to salvation. Sermons grew harsher, urging the faithful to shun carnal pleasures and focus instead on prayer and good works. Public flagellation processions became common, as groups of believers marched through streets, whipping themselves in collective acts of contrition. The idea that lust had brought the plague upon the world was widely accepted, creating a culture where desire was both feared and demonized. Yet in private, the human heart continued to beat with yearning. Letters and diaries from the period reveal moments of tenderness and desperation, where lovers separated by quarantine wrote longing messages, where widows sought companionship amid loneliness, and where secret marriages took place in hidden chapels, defying both the church's restrictions and the fears that gripped society. Medical knowledge of the time was limited and often misguided. Theories about how the plague spread ranged from miasmas, poisonous vapors rising from the earth, to punishment from God, to more practical observations about fleas and rats, though the latter would not be confirmed until centuries later. In response, communities adopted a variety of measures, from quarantine stations outside city gates to the wearing of fragrant herbs and masks stuffed with aromatic substances, intended to ward off the bad air believed to carry disease. These practices extended into domestic life, influencing how families approached intimacy, often forcing physical distance even between spouses. Social norms shifted in unexpected ways. Some records show a rise in clandestine relationships as fear of public scrutiny increased. Others indicate a temporary relaxation of certain taboos as people sought comfort in one another, recognizing the fragility of life. The plague's impact on gender roles was profound. With many men lost to the disease or war, women took on new responsibilities, including managing estates, participating in trade, and sometimes entering relationships that defied traditional expectations. The plague also altered rituals around death and mourning, which in turn affected expressions of love and desire. Funeral customs became hurried and austere, with less opportunity for communal grieving. This lack of closure sometimes drove survivors toward impulsive unions. Marriages contracted quickly in the shadow of loss, and an urgency to experience life's pleasures before fate intervened again. In art and literature, the theme of mortality and its interplay with desire became prevalent. The dance of death motif, depicting skeletons leading men and women of all classes to their graves, reminded viewers of life's impermanence, encouraging both piety and the enjoyment of fleeting earthly pleasures. Poets grappled with the tension between spiritual salvation and earthly longing, crafting verses that mourned lost loves even as they celebrated passion. Thus, the plague reshaped not only the physical landscape of medieval Europe, but also the intimate, emotional terrain of its people, forging new patterns of connection, fear, and resilience that would echo through generations to come. In the aftermath of the devastating plagues, communities struggled to rebuild, and with rebuilding came changes in social structure and personal relationships that subtly yet profoundly altered the medieval understanding of intimacy and sexuality. Labor shortages gave surviving peasants greater bargaining power, leading to shifts in marriage practices and gender dynamics. Young men and women, fewer in number but more in demand, found themselves negotiating terms that earlier generations could only dream of, sometimes choosing partners for affection as much as economic security. This emergent freedom, however limited, sparked new conversations around consent and desire that echoed quietly through village gatherings and marketplace chatter. The church, while attempting to reassert control over bodies and behavior, faced challenges. Clergy who once wielded unquestioned authority found themselves grappling with the complexities of a population whose experiences of loss and survival had reshaped priorities. Confessionals filled not just with sins of lust, but with fears of loneliness, guilt over broken family ties, and questions about remarriage and sexuality in a world shadowed by death. The penances handed down became more nuanced, reflecting an evolving pastoral approach aimed at guiding rather than merely punishing. In literature and art, this period witnessed a flourishing of works exploring the tension between earthly desire and spiritual devotion. The troubadours and minzingers sang songs that wove tales of unattainable love and courtly passion, often idealizing relationships that transcended the physical, while illuminated manuscripts depicted scenes of both sacred matrimony and secular flirtation with intricate detail and subtle symbolism. These cultural expressions provided outlets for imagination and longing within the confines of prevailing moral codes. At the same time, medical knowledge slowly advanced, challenging some of the superstitions that had clouded understanding of the body and reproduction. Midwives shared remedies and techniques, passing oral knowledge that would eventually influence early scientific inquiry. Although the full picture of human anatomy and sexual health remained elusive, the seeds of curiosity were planted, marking a gradual shift toward empirical observation. Despite these changes, the fundamental paradox of medieval sexuality persisted. The body as both vessel of sin and source of life, desire both feared and celebrated, constrained by doctrine yet expressed in countless private ways. Festivities such as May Day dances, harvest celebrations, and saints' feast days offered sanctioned moments when social norms loosened, allowing flirtation, courtship, and physical expression to surface amid music, dance, and communal joy. These ephemeral freedoms punctuated the otherwise rigid rhythms of work and worship. Moreover, the persistence of folk traditions provided a parallel narrative. Beliefs in charms, spells, and rituals related to fertility, love, and protection survived alongside official doctrine, often practiced in secret or woven into everyday routines. Women, in particular, played vital roles as custodians of this knowledge, balancing the demands of church and community with the practicalities of life and the mysteries of the body. The medieval world, then, emerges not as a monolith of repression but as a tapestry of contradictions and adaptations, where human beings negotiated the boundaries of intimacy amidst shifting social, religious, and economic landscapes. This complex interplay continued to evolve, setting the stage for transformations that would ripple into the Renaissance and beyond. Amidst the ever-changing tides of medieval life, one element remained constant: the profound intertwining of sex and power. Whether in grand castles, bustling towns, or quiet villages, the ability to control, deny, or assert bodily desires was inseparable from social hierarchy, gender roles, and political intrigue. Noble courts were rife with whispered alliances, clandestine affairs, and calculated marriages designed to consolidate wealth and influence. For kings and queens and courtiers, the bedroom was often a theater of negotiation as much as passion, a place where loyalties were tested, heirs produced, and reputations forged or destroyed. Women's sexuality, in particular, was heavily policed and mythologized. The Virgin Mary stood as the ideal of purity and submission, while simultaneously, medieval folklore brimmed with tales of seductive enchantresses, witches, and sirens who wielded erotic power as a form of danger and rebellion. Church authorities warned that a woman's uncontrolled desire could lead to chaos not only in her own life but across entire kingdoms, linking morality to social order in ways that made female sexuality a subject of both fascination and fear. Consequently, women's bodies became battlegrounds where theology, law, and custom intersected. The legal system reflected these anxieties with codes that varied from region to region but consistently sought to regulate sexual conduct. Accusations of adultery, fornication, or worse could ruin families, provoke feuds, or become tools for political maneuvering. In some places, courts employed ordeals or public trials to determine guilt, while elsewhere, penance and reconciliation were emphasized. The social consequences were severe. A woman found guilty of adultery might be publicly shamed, fined, or even banished. Men often faced lighter punishments, exposing the gendered imbalance woven into medieval jurisprudence. Yet, even within these constraints, stories emerge of women who exercised agency in surprising ways. Some became patrons of the arts, using their influence to shape cultural perceptions of love and desire. Others navigated court life with cunning, leveraging relationships to advance family fortunes or protect vulnerable kin. Letters and poems reveal women articulating their own experiences of longing, grief, and pleasure, challenging modern assumptions that medieval femininity was purely passive or submissive. Meanwhile, men grappled with ideals of masculinity that demanded both chastity and virility. Knights were expected to embody strength and honor, yet to control their passions lest they jeopardize spiritual salvation or social standing. Monastic orders preached celibacy, while troubadours glorified romantic love in paradoxical verses filled with longing and restraint. This tension shaped male identity in complex ways, influencing everything from marriage customs to warfare. Medieval festivities, rich tapestries of sound, color, and movement, served as crucial outlets where the usual strictures surrounding sexuality loosened just enough to allow for more open expressions of desire and playfulness, though always under a veneer of ritual and communal consent. These celebrations, whether marking the arrival of spring, the harvest, or a saint's feast day, were punctuated by dances, songs, and games that often contained symbolic gestures or narratives related to fertility and courtship, embodying a subtle dialogue between societal norms and the primal rhythms of human longing. During May Day, for example, villagers might gather to crown a May Queen and engage in dances around the maypole, its towering ribbons weaving a visual metaphor for intertwined relationships. Participants would sometimes flirt openly, exchange tokens, or recite verses laden with double meanings, all within the permissive space the festival created. Similarly, harvest festivals brought communities together in shared labor and celebration, where the line between work and pleasure blurred, and where stories of love and lust were exchanged as eagerly as baskets of fruit and grain. In towns and cities, fairs served a comparable function, drawing people from across regions into temporary spaces where the usual social hierarchies could relax. Here, street performers, minstrels, and actors presented plays replete with body humor and sexual innuendo, challenging authority even as they entertained. Such performances were more than mere diversion. They offered a communal catharsis, a way to acknowledge and laugh at the contradictions between official morality and everyday desires. Underlying these festivities were ancient folk beliefs that linked human fertility to the cycles of nature. Rituals involving flowers, eggs, and animals, symbols of life's renewal, were commonplace, their meanings layered and sometimes hidden beneath Christian reinterpretations. Women might carry sprigs of rosemary for protection and love, or young couples engage in secret nighttime meetings in orchards or groves believed to be enchanted spaces where wishes might come true. While the church often attempted to co-opt or suppress these practices, the resilience of folk tradition ensured their persistence. Clergy sometimes preached stern sermons condemning revelry and the lustful excesses of the populace. Yet many priests themselves participated in or at least tolerated local customs, recognizing their role in community cohesion and spiritual balance. The interplay between official doctrine and popular culture created a dynamic tension that shaped medieval sexuality in complex ways. People navigated between fear of divine punishment and the desire for earthly pleasure, using humor, ritual, and social gatherings to negotiate their place within these often conflicting demands. This rich cultural fabric was mirrored in the arts, where painters, poets, and musicians explored themes of love, temptation, and fidelity. Illuminated manuscripts featured marginalia with playful or risque images. Troubadour songs praised courtly passion while veiling carnal desire and allegory, and stained glass windows sometimes depicted biblical tales infused with human emotion and subtle references to human relationships. In the next part, we will delve deeper into the medical understanding of sexuality in the Middle Ages, the beliefs, remedies, and treatments that shaped how people cared for their bodies and approached intimacy amid the limited scientific knowledge of their time. Medicine in the medieval world was a complex blend of inherited ancient wisdom, local folk remedies, religious doctrine, and emerging empirical observations, creating a framework through which people understood their bodies, including the mysteries of sexuality and reproduction. Unlike modern medicine's scientific approach, medieval healing was deeply intertwined with symbolism and spirituality, where illnesses were often seen as manifestations of moral or cosmic imbalance, and treatments combined physical substances with prayers, rituals, and charms. This holistic view permeated attitudes toward sexual health, fertility, and even pleasure itself. Midwives, herbalists, and physicians formed a network of caregivers who were as much healers of the soul as of the flesh. Midwives, in particular, held essential knowledge passed down orally through generations, guiding women through pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum care, often navigating a precarious balance between accepted medical practices and taboo topics. Their role extended beyond the clinical. They were confidants, counselors, and guardians of female reproductive knowledge in a world where formal education was mostly closed to women. Medical texts of the time, often translations of classical works by Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna, described the body according to humoral theory, positing that health depended on the balance of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that imbalances could affect not only physical health but temperament and sexual function. Treatments aimed to restore equilibrium through bloodletting, purging, dietary changes, and herbal concoctions, with specific recipes targeting reproductive organs or sexual desire. Beliefs about sexual function were intertwined with these humoral ideas. Excess heat in the body was thought to stimulate desire, while coldness could diminish it. Certain foods, spices, and activities were prescribed or forbidden based on their perceived effect on humors. For example, red meat and wine were considered hot and aphrodisiacal, whereas cucumbers and dairy were cold and thought to reduce lust. This framework shaped not only medical advice but social expectations around behavior and diet. Diseases believed to be sexually transmitted were poorly understood but feared. Conditions causing genital sores, infertility, or chronic pain were often attributed to moral failings or demonic influence, complicating treatment and social acceptance. Quarantine and isolation of the sick were common, but stigma persisted, affecting victims' lives far beyond their physical ailments. The church's influence extended deeply into medical practice. Clergy often acted as healers, and prayers or relics were prescribed alongside physical remedies. Sexuality was approached with caution, as excessive desire was linked to sin, yet marital relations for procreation were encouraged, if carefully controlled. Confessionals sometimes doubled as medical consultations, blurring boundaries between spiritual and bodily health. Remedies for sexual and reproductive issues were as varied as they were inventive. Herbal mixtures containing ingredients like mandrake, nettle, and yarrow were common, as were potions promising to enhance fertility or quell desire. Amulets inscribed with prayers or zodiac symbols were worn for protection or influence over love and conception. Some treatments involved rituals performed at specific times or places believed to hold magical properties. Despite limitations, medieval medicine exhibited moments of curiosity and empirical observation. Physicians recorded case histories, attempted surgical interventions, and debated theories, laying groundwork for future advances. The tension between tradition and innovation was a hallmark of the era's medical culture. Through this lens, we see that sexuality in the Middle Ages was not merely a matter of morality or sin, but also deeply connected to health, well-being, and survival. Understanding the body and its desires was part of a broader quest to navigate a world where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual were constantly negotiated. In the next part, we will explore the role of marriage ceremonies and rituals, revealing how symbolism, custom, and community shaped the public and private dimensions of medieval unions. Marriage in the medieval world was far more than a private agreement between two individuals. It was a public, communal event that intertwined legal, religious, and social dimensions, each layer reflecting the complex tapestry of medieval life. The ceremony itself varied widely depending on region, class, and circumstance, but it consistently served as a marker of status, alliance, and the perpetuation of family lines, while also embodying deeply symbolic gestures that conveyed the hopes, fears, and expectations placed upon the union. In many rural communities, marriage began with a simple but solemn exchange of consent. Spoken vows made before witnesses, often neighbors or local officials, without elaborate ceremony. These informal unions, sometimes called common law marriages today, were legally binding, underscoring the importance of communal acknowledgement over ritual pomp. Couples might share a meal or host a small gathering, but grand celebrations were the privilege of the wealthy, whose weddings could last for days and involve entire networks of political and economic alliances. Religious rites evolved over centuries to formalize these unions more thoroughly, with the church increasingly asserting control over marriage ceremonies. By the late Middle Ages, the presence of a priest and the public proclamation of vows became essential components, alongside the blessing of the couple and the exchange of rings, symbols of fidelity and eternal commitment. The ritual was rich in symbolism. The joining of hands, the lighting of candles, the sharing of bread and wine, all evoked the sanctity of the union as both a social contract and a sacred covenant. Dowries played a crucial role, functioning as both a financial foundation for the new household and a symbol of familial alliances. These could range from money and land to livestock or valuable goods, and disputes over dowries sometimes led to legal battles or estrangement. The bride's family often bore responsibility for providing the dowry, reinforcing gendered expectations around marriage and economic exchange. Clothing and adornment were carefully chosen to convey messages of purity, status, and fertility. Brides commonly wore veils and white or brightly colored gowns, though the white wedding dress as we know it today was rare. Colors such as blue or green were also popular. Embroidery and jewels displayed wealth and connection, while bouquets and garlands incorporated flowers believed to promote fertility and protect against evil spirits. Music, feasting, and dancing were integral to the celebration, serving as expressions of joy and communal solidarity. Minstrels and troubadours might perform songs celebrating the couple or recounting legendary romances, weaving personal narratives into broader cultural traditions. Dancing allowed for playful interactions and the subtle negotiation of social boundaries, with partners choosing or being chosen in ways that mirrored courtship practices. Yet beneath the festivities lay tensions and anxieties. The consummation of marriage was a pivotal moment, confirming the union's validity and initiating the couple into the responsibilities of family life. Failure to consummate could lead to annulment or scandal, while fertility was both a blessing and an expectation, with childlessness often viewed with suspicion or pity. Medical and spiritual advice surrounded these intimate aspects, reflecting the intertwined nature of physical health and moral standing. Legal frameworks varied but increasingly codified marriage as a binding contract with social and economic consequences. Consent was paramount, yet in many cases, especially among the nobility, marriages were arranged by families to secure alliances or property, sometimes with little regard for the wishes of those involved. This tension between duty and desire played out in countless personal stories lost to history but glimpsed through letters, court records, and literature. The role of community extended beyond the ceremony itself. Neighbors and kin acted as witnesses, guarantors, and participants in the ongoing life of the marriage, offering support or judgment as needed. The couple's behavior was subject to scrutiny, reinforcing social norms and expectations. Divorce was rare and difficult, and remarriage often complicated inheritance and legitimacy, highlighting marriage's centrality to medieval social order. Through these rituals and structures, marriage embodied the complex intersections of love, power, faith, and survival. It was a living institution reflecting the values and contradictions of medieval society, shaping not only individual lives but the course of history itself. Alongside formal marriages, the medieval period was also marked by a rich tapestry of courtship rituals and social practices that shaped how people expressed desire, built relationships, and navigated the often delicate balance between societal expectation and personal longing. Courtship was not simply a private affair but a public performance in many respects, woven through with codes of conduct, symbolic gestures, and communal oversight that guided interactions from the first glance to the sealing of a union. The medieval marketplace, village green, and festival grounds were vibrant arenas where young men and women met, exchanged tokens, and tested their compatibilities through dance, song, and conversation. Flirtation was an art form, carefully practiced within boundaries that maintained honor and reputation. A well-timed glance, a coy smile, or the discreet passing of a handkerchief could convey interest without overt declaration, allowing for social maneuvering that preserved dignity while expressing intent. Songs and poetry played central roles in courtship. Troubadours and minstrels performed ballads celebrating idealized love, valor, and beauty, often portraying romantic pursuit as a noble quest fraught with obstacles and longing. These artistic expressions not only entertained but also instructed audiences in the virtues of patience, devotion, and discretion, shaping the cultural vocabulary through which love was understood and enacted. Gift-giving was another important custom, with suitors presenting symbolic items such as rings, gloves, or embroidered cloths as tangible signs of affection and commitment. These gifts, often carefully crafted and imbued with meaning, could be publicly displayed or privately treasured, serving as both social currency and personal tokens. The exchange of gifts reinforced bonds and signaled intentions to both families and communities. Parental and community involvement was significant. Families often supervised courtship to ensure matches aligned with social status, economic interests, and moral suitability. Public reputation mattered greatly, and breaches of decorum could result in scandal or punishment. Yet within these constraints, individuals found ways to express genuine affection, negotiate terms, and build connections that sometimes blossomed into lasting partnerships. Courtship could be prolonged and complex, involving a series of meetings, letters, and intermediaries who relayed messages and arranged encounters. This gradual process allowed for the cultivation of trust and familiarity, essential in societies where marriages carried lifelong consequences. The delicate dance of consent and persuasion played out against a backdrop of social expectation and personal hope. In some cases, romantic love was idealized and celebrated, especially within the aristocracy where the concept of courtly love flourished. A chivalric code that exalted noble devotion, often unattainable and unconsummated, as a source of personal refinement and artistic inspiration. This ideal sometimes conflicted with the practical realities of arranged marriages, creating a tension between public duty and private desire that found expression in literature and song. For common folk, courtship was equally meaningful but often more pragmatic, balancing affection with economic necessity. Shared work, mutual aid, and community standing influenced choices, and while passion was no less real, survival and social harmony were paramount. Folk customs, such as maypole dances or community feasts, provided sanctioned opportunities for young people to meet and mingle under watchful eyes. Despite the layers of control and expectation, medieval courtship was a space of negotiation, creativity, and emotional depth. People navigated complex social codes, expressing hope, fear, and longing within a framework that demanded both discretion and sincerity. Through these rituals, they forged connections that sustained families, communities, and cultures, leaving traces of their desires woven into the fabric of history. Beyond the public performances of courtship and marriage, the private realities of medieval sexual life were shaped by a constellation of personal fears, hopes, and everyday practices, many of which were seldom recorded but can be glimpsed through legal cases, medical advice, and personal letters. The bedroom, often hidden behind layers of social expectation and religious teaching, was a complex space where pleasure, duty, uncertainty, and vulnerability intertwined, creating experiences that were as diverse as the people themselves. Conceptions of privacy in the Middle Ages were markedly different from modern understandings. Walls were thin, and households often shared living spaces, making secrecy difficult but also fostering a communal awareness of intimate life. Neighbors might overhear whispered conversations or the creak of a bedpost, leading to gossip, intervention, or protection, depending on relationships and local customs. This proximity shaped how couples approached sexuality, balancing desire with discretion and negotiation. Sexual education was informal and limited, often conveyed through family instruction, peer knowledge, or the occasional counsel of midwives and priests. Myths and misconceptions abounded, mixing observation with folklore. For example, it was commonly believed that men needed to release seed regularly to maintain health, while women's bodies were often described in terms of mysterious humors and energies that influenced their behavior and fertility. Such ideas shaped expectations and anxieties around sexual activity. Contraception and fertility control, though primitive by today's standards, were subjects of practical concern. Herbal remedies, such as infusions of pennyroyal, rue, or Queen Anne's lace, were used to prevent or terminate pregnancies, though their effectiveness and safety varied widely. These practices were sometimes condemned by religious authorities but persisted in popular use, reflecting the complex interplay between doctrine and lived experience. The role of pleasure itself was contested. While official teachings emphasized sex's procreative purpose and warned against excess, literature and personal writings reveal that desire and enjoyment were acknowledged aspects of human experience, albeit often veiled in euphemism or moral framing. The tension between duty and desire played out within relationships, influencing how couples negotiated intimacy over time. Legal records occasionally exposed darker realities. Cases of sexual violence, coercion, and abuse were prosecuted, though justice was uneven and often influenced by social status and gender. Women's testimonies might be discounted, and powerful men frequently escaped accountability, highlighting the vulnerabilities many faced. Yet these documents also attest to the courage of individuals who sought redress and the community's role in adjudicating such conflicts. Health concerns loomed large in private life. Fear of disease, infertility, and complications from childbirth influenced behaviors and attitudes. Couples might delay intercourse during illness or ritual impurity, adhere to fasting periods, or use amulets for protection. The intersection of spirituality and medicine shaped practices aimed at safeguarding both body and soul. Sexual rituals extended beyond the act itself. The preparation of the marital bed, the selection of linens embroidered with symbols of fertility, and the recitation of prayers before union all imbued the experience with layers of meaning and hope. Stories of saints and martyrs who exemplified chastity or divine love provided models that inspired or challenged individuals' choices. Throughout these intimate spaces, people negotiated the complexities of love, power, faith, and survival. Their lives remind us that medieval sexuality was not merely a set of prohibitions, but a lived reality full of contradictions, adaptations, and humanity. In understanding these private moments, we gain insight into the fullness of medieval life beyond the official narratives. The social fabric of medieval communities was closely woven with ritualized expressions of love and desire, which extended beyond individual relationships to encompass broader societal functions. One of the most fascinating aspects of this interplay was the role of festivals and theatrical performances, which served as sanctioned spaces where the usual rules governing behavior were suspended, inverted, or playfully subverted, allowing participants to explore themes of sexuality and power in a communal context. Mummers' plays, mystery cycles, and other forms of popular theater often included scenes rich with sexual innuendo, double entendres, and characters embodying archetypes such as the lecherous old man, the cunning wife, or the foolish lover. These performances, held during important calendrical moments like Christmas or Carnival, offered a public forum where tensions surrounding sex, marriage, and morality could be expressed through humor and exaggeration, providing both entertainment and social commentary. Carnival itself was a time of reversal and release, where peasants might don masks and costumes that blurred identities, allowing for behavior that would otherwise be punished. Licentious dancing, mock weddings, and feasting created a temporary suspension of hierarchy and decorum, offering a release valve for social pressures and anxieties related to sexuality and reproduction. The Church's ambivalent stance, alternating between condemnation and tolerance, reflected the complex necessity of these rituals in maintaining communal balance. These festive expressions were deeply connected to fertility symbolism. Characters and actions often embodied the cycles of nature, death and rebirth, sowing and harvest, linking human sexuality to cosmic rhythms. Phallic imagery, fertility rites, and symbolic gestures were common, reminding participants of their place within a world governed by unseen forces. Through laughter and ritual, communities confronted the mysteries of life and death, desire and restraint. Additionally, these performances served as pedagogical tools, communicating social norms, religious teachings, and cultural values in accessible ways. By dramatizing the consequences of lust, infidelity, or chastity, they reinforced communal expectations while allowing audiences to vicariously experience transgression and redemption. The collective nature of these events forged bonds of identity and belonging, uniting individuals across class and gender lines in shared experience. Beyond formal festivals, everyday humor, found in graffiti, poetry, and oral tradition, revealed a medieval mindset that was both pragmatic and playful regarding sex. Jokes about bodily functions, sexual mishaps, and romantic escapades circulated widely, reflecting human desires to cope with taboos through laughter and storytelling. This humor often challenged authority, exposing hypocrisies and highlighting the gap between public virtue and private vice. Such cultural expressions underscore the fact that medieval sexuality was never monolithic or solely repressive. Instead, it was dynamic and multifaceted, embedded within a social system that recognized both the necessity and the peril of desire. Through ritual, performance, and humor, communities negotiated their fears and hopes, creating a rich landscape where sexuality was both a source of tension and a wellspring of life. The interplay of power and sexuality in medieval religious institutions reveals another dimension of the era's complex relationship with intimacy. Monastic life, with its vows of celibacy and rigorous discipline, was ostensibly designed to renounce worldly desires, yet the realities within convents, monasteries, and clerical households were often more complicated. These sacred spaces became sites where human passions coexisted with spiritual aspirations, and where the control of the body was both a personal challenge and a communal imperative. Monks and nuns lived under strict rules that demanded chastity, obedience, and poverty, yet the enforcement of these vows varied widely depending on local circumstances, leadership, and individual temperament. Stories of transgressions, both minor and scandalous, circulated in ecclesiastical records, reflecting the tensions inherent in attempting to suppress deeply ingrained human impulses. Such accounts also reveal networks of surveillance and confession designed to monitor behavior and maintain discipline, often leading to public penance or exile. Within convent walls, women experienced unique forms of autonomy and constraint. Religious life offered an alternative to marriage and motherhood, granting some degree of education, authority, and community belonging. At the same time, nuns navigated expectations of purity and submission, with their sexuality scrutinized by both religious superiors and society at large. Some convents became centers of learning and artistic production, while others were criticized for lax discipline or worldly entanglements. Celibacy among clergy was idealized but not uniformly practiced. Instances of illicit relationships, secret children, and abuses of power emerged in various regions, prompting reform efforts and papal decrees aimed at strengthening moral standards. These challenges highlighted the human difficulty of reconciling spiritual ideals with biological reality, and the consequences for both individuals and institutions when these tensions erupted. Confession played a central role in mediating sexuality within religious contexts. The sacrament required believers to disclose sins, including those related to lust, adultery, and masturbation, offering a means of spiritual cleansing but also a mechanism of control. Confessors held significant power, sometimes using intimate knowledge for personal influence, while penitents faced prescribed acts of contrition ranging from prayers to public acts of humility. The rhetoric of sin and virtue permeated sermons, theological writings, and popular literature, shaping collective attitudes towards sex and desire. Concepts such as the 7 deadly sins and the virtue of chastity were taught to instill discipline and moral clarity, yet lived experience often diverged from these ideals. The gap between doctrine and practice created spaces where individuals negotiated their beliefs and behaviors in nuanced and sometimes contradictory ways. Moreover, the symbolic use of sexual imagery in religious art and literature reflected an ambivalence toward the body. Mystical writings might describe the soul's union with the divine in erotic terms, while biblical stories of temptation and redemption offered moral lessons framed by sexual metaphor. These expressions reveal a medieval consciousness attuned to the power of desire as both a spiritual challenge and a transformative force. Understanding the role of religion in shaping medieval sexuality provides insight into the broader cultural and social systems that influenced behavior and belief. The interplay of control and transgression, sanctity and sin, reflected the complex humanity of an era negotiating the boundaries between flesh and spirit. While religious doctrine sought to regulate and often suppress sexuality, the world beyond the cloister walls thrived with a vibrant and multifaceted sexual culture that both intersected with and diverged from ecclesiastical teachings. The marketplaces, taverns, and urban neighborhoods of medieval Europe were alive with encounters, negotiations, and expressions of desire that reflected the realities of human experience amid societal constraints. Taverns served as social hubs where men and women of various classes mingled, shared stories, and engaged in courtship or more casual liaisons. The convivial atmosphere, fueled by music, dance, and ale, lowered inhibitions and fostered connections that ranged from fleeting flirtations to long-term relationships. Here, social boundaries could be both reinforced and crossed, with status, reputation, and economic power shaping the dynamics of interaction. Prostitution, though officially condemned, was a widespread and tolerated aspect of urban life, regulated in some cities through licenses, taxation, and health inspections. Prostitutes often occupied a precarious social position, marginalized yet essential, stigmatized yet economically influential. Some managed to secure protection from local authorities or patrons, navigating the complexities of survival and agency within a hostile environment. Street vendors and performers contributed to the lively sexual culture with bawdy songs, jokes, and pantomimes that openly addressed themes of love, fertility, and bodily humor. These public expressions served as both entertainment and social commentary, allowing communities to engage with sexuality in ways that were simultaneously irreverent and deeply human. Marriage and family life coexisted with these more informal and sometimes transgressive practices, creating a spectrum of sexual expression that defied simple categorization. Individuals negotiated personal desires within frameworks of obligation, faith, and social expectation, resulting in diverse experiences shaped by geography, class, gender, and circumstance. The legal system addressed sexual offenses with varying degrees of severity, often reflecting the social status of those involved. Cases of adultery, seduction, or rape could lead to public trials and punishments ranging from fines to corporal penalties. Yet enforcement was inconsistent, and social networks frequently influenced outcomes, underscoring the interplay of power and sexuality. Medical treatises and popular remedies continued to address sexual health and fertility, blending empirical observation with superstition. Fertility was prized, and childlessness was a source of anxiety and social pressure, leading couples to seek treatments ranging from herbal infusions to pilgrimages to sacred sites believed to grant conception. Throughout these varied contexts, humor, storytelling, and ritual provided means to cope with the contradictions and challenges inherent in medieval sexuality. The lived reality was one of negotiation, resilience, and creativity, where individuals balanced fear and desire, duty and pleasure, in a world defined by both constraint and possibility. The landscape of medieval sexuality was further complicated by the influence of magic, superstition, and folk beliefs, which permeated everyday life and shaped how individuals understood and managed desire, fertility, and protection against unseen forces. From charms and talismans to rituals and incantations, these practices existed alongside official religious teachings, often in tension but sometimes blending in ways that reflected the pragmatic concerns of ordinary people. Women, in particular, were central figures in this realm, often acting as healers, midwives, and custodians of secret knowledge passed down through generations. They crafted potions from herbs like mandrake, henbane, and rosemary, plants believed to possess powers over love, conception, and sexual potency. Some of these remedies aimed to stimulate desire, others to prevent unwanted pregnancy, and still others to protect against curses or the evil eye. The fear of witchcraft and demonic influence cast a shadow over these practices, leading to periods of persecution and trials. Accusations of witchcraft were frequently linked to sexual transgressions or claims of supernatural control over fertility and relationships. Yet, for many, the line between healing and sorcery was blurred, as community members sought help from those reputed to possess magical abilities, especially when conventional medicine failed. Rituals tied to the agricultural calendar, such as planting ceremonies and harvest celebrations, often incorporated symbolic acts meant to ensure fertility of the land and its people. These included offerings, dances, and the use of phallic symbols, reflecting the deep connections medieval societies drew between human sexuality and the cycles of nature. Astrology also played a significant role. The positions of stars and planets were believed to influence human health and behavior, including sexual activity and reproduction. Couples consulted astrologers to determine auspicious times for marriage, conception, or other intimate acts, seeking to align their lives with cosmic forces to ensure success and protection. Superstitions regarding the body abounded. For example, it was believed that a woman's dreams could predict pregnancy or the sex of an unborn child. Certain marks or blemishes were interpreted as signs of past sins or future fortune. These beliefs influenced how individuals perceived their bodies and experiences, blending spiritual meaning with physical reality. Despite official condemnations, these magical and folk practices persisted because they addressed immediate needs and uncertainties that formal institutions often could not resolve. They offered hope, agency, and a sense of control in a world fraught with dangers both seen and unseen. In understanding medieval sexuality, acknowledging the role of magic and superstition is essential, as it reveals a society striving to make sense of desire, reproduction, and the mysteries of life through a rich tapestry of belief and practice. In the shadow of castles and beneath the vaulted ceilings of grand cathedrals, the lives of medieval nobility unfolded in a world governed by intricate codes of honor, duty, and passion, where sexuality was both a private matter and a public spectacle. The aristocratic class wielded immense power, shaping politics, culture, and social norms, and their intimate relationships often reflected the tensions between personal desire and dynastic responsibility. Marriages among nobles were predominantly arranged, designed to secure alliances, expand territories, and consolidate wealth. Love was frequently a secondary consideration, though historical records reveal moments of genuine affection, jealousy, and heartbreak that humanized these figures. The pressure to produce legitimate heirs to continue family lines was paramount, and failure in this regard could lead to scandal, displacement, or even civil strife. Courtly love emerged as a cultural ideal within aristocratic circles, romanticizing the pursuit of unattainable, often married, women by noble knights. This phenomenon was less about physical consummation and more about ennobling passion, expressed through poetry, music, and chivalric deeds. It created a vocabulary of longing, devotion, and respectful distance that influenced the literature and art of the time. Noble households were centers of cultural production, where minstrels and troubadours performed songs and recited tales that celebrated or lamented love and desire. These performances were not mere entertainment but social rituals reinforcing values and ideals. The patrons' tastes shaped artistic expressions, blending the sacred and the profane in nuanced ways. Despite the idealization of courtly love, the realities of noble sexuality were often pragmatic. Mistresses held recognized positions at court, their influence sometimes rivaling that of wives. These relationships could be politically strategic, socially accepted, or sources of conflict. Children born out of wedlock, while illegitimate, occasionally played important roles in succession or diplomacy. Sexual health and fertility were subjects of considerable concern, with physicians and midwives attending to noble couples in hopes of ensuring progeny. The secrecy and discretion surrounding these matters contrasted with their public importance. Fertility treatments combined medical knowledge with folk remedies and religious rituals, reflecting the multifaceted approach to reproduction. Power dynamics extended into sexual relationships, with issues of consent, coercion, and agency varying widely depending on status, personality, and circumstance. The interplay of love, obligation, and control shaped experiences that could be both tender and brutal, public and private. In sum, the nobility's approach to sexuality was a microcosm of medieval society's broader contradictions, where passion and politics, devotion and duty, desire and discipline intertwined in complex and enduring ways. While the nobility's intimate lives often drew the attention of chroniclers and poets, the realities of peasant sexuality were shaped by different forces: hard labor, communal living, and limited resources, yet no less complex or meaningful. For the vast majority of medieval people, daily survival took precedence, but even within these constraints, relationships were formed, desires experienced, and social norms navigated with nuance and resilience. Marriage among peasants often began with a mutual agreement, sometimes solidified through informal ceremonies that emphasized community recognition over elaborate ritual. These unions were essential for organizing labor, managing land, and ensuring the continuity of family units. While love and attraction were factors, practical concerns like economic stability and social support played significant roles. The rhythms of peasant life influenced sexual activity. Seasonal labor, religious fasting periods, and communal events all shaped when and how intimacy was expressed. For example, Lent and Advent were times of sexual abstinence, while celebrations and harvest times allowed more freedom. Such cyclical patterns intertwined bodily desire with agricultural and spiritual calendars, reflecting a holistic worldview. Living conditions also affected privacy and relationships. Families often shared small, crowded dwellings with limited separation between generations, making discretion a challenge. Yet community bonds provided support networks for raising children, caring for the sick, and managing household tasks. Gossip and social surveillance helped enforce moral codes, but also created spaces for negotiation and forgiveness. Folklore and oral tradition played vital roles in shaping attitudes toward love, marriage, and sexuality among peasants. Stories, songs, and proverbs transmitted cultural values, warned of dangers, and celebrated virtues. These narratives offered models of behavior and moral lessons embedded in accessible, memorable forms. Childbirth and child-rearing were central concerns. High mortality rates and the physical demands of motherhood shaped women's experiences profoundly. Midwives and older women provided essential knowledge and support, bridging practical care with spiritual guidance. Fertility was both hoped for and feared, with unsuccessful pregnancies carrying social and emotional consequences. Sexual transgressions were addressed through community mechanisms, often emphasizing reconciliation and restoration over punishment. Public shaming, fines, or penance might be imposed, but neighbors also played roles in mediating conflicts and supporting families. This communal approach reflected the interdependence of village life. Despite hardships, peasants found joy, passion, and companionship. Love songs, dances, and festivals allowed expressions of desire and connection within socially accepted frameworks. Relationships were lived experiences rich with emotion, humor, and complexity. Thus, peasant sexuality emerges as a vital and dynamic facet of medieval life, shaped by environment, culture, and human need, revealing a world where intimacy was both ordinary and extraordinary. In the medieval imagination, symbols and metaphors related to sex and fertility permeated art, literature, and daily life, revealing a rich symbolic language that communicated desires, fears, and social values often hidden beneath surface appearances. These symbols served as visual and verbal codes, allowing people to navigate complex attitudes toward sexuality in a society where explicit discussion was often taboo or regulated by authority. One of the most pervasive symbols was the garden, a space of growth, temptation, and renewal. Gardens appeared in illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, and poetry as settings for romantic encounters, spiritual reflection, or allegorical tales. The enclosed garden, or hortus conclusus, symbolized purity and chastity, particularly in religious contexts associated with the Virgin Mary, while simultaneously evoking the sensual pleasures of nature's bounty. Floral imagery was abundant, with specific flowers carrying particular meanings. Roses, lilies, and violets, for example, were linked to love, purity, and modesty, respectively. These botanical symbols adorned wedding garments, bridal chambers, and love tokens, weaving nature's language into human relationships. Flowers also played roles in folk rituals aimed at promoting fertility or protecting against evil, connecting personal desire with broader cycles of life. Animals, too, were imbued with symbolic sexual significance. The hare, known for its rapid reproduction, represented fertility and vitality. The peacock's display of feathers symbolized beauty and vanity, while the serpent embodied temptation and danger. These creatures appeared in art and storytelling, reinforcing moral lessons or highlighting human traits through metaphor. Colors carried layered meanings as well. Red suggested passion and vitality, but also sin and danger. White stood for purity and innocence. Green evoked growth and renewal. The deliberate use of color in clothing, decor, and manuscript illumination communicated messages about status, intent, and character. Erotic imagery was sometimes concealed within the margins of religious texts marginalia that combined humor, satire, and subtle commentary. These playful or provocative illustrations revealed a medieval penchant for mixing the sacred and the profane, reminding readers of the ever-present tension between desire and discipline. Poetry and song employed metaphor and allegory to explore love and longing. The language of chivalry and courtly love created a lexicon that could express deep emotion while adhering to social constraints. Compliments, laments, and declarations were crafted with care, balancing openness with discretion. Even household objects bore symbolic weight. Embroidered linens, carved bedposts, and painted ceramics might incorporate motifs meant to invite fertility or protect the marriage bed, integrating belief and artistry into everyday life. Through this rich symbolism, medieval people communicated complex and often contradictory ideas about sex, love, and morality, creating a shared cultural vocabulary that transcended spoken language and bridged public and private worlds. The dynamics of gender roles in medieval sexuality were deeply embedded in the social, religious, and economic structures of the time, shaping expectations, behaviors, and power relations between men and women. While rigid in many respects, these roles were also sites of negotiation and complexity, reflecting the diverse realities of individuals within a stratified society. Men were typically positioned as dominant figures in both public and private spheres, expected to provide for families, assert authority, and embody ideals of chivalry or masculinity. Their sexual activity was often linked to notions of virility, honor, and control, with societal tolerance for certain behaviors, such as extramarital affairs or the keeping of mistresses. The intersection of gender and sexuality was also shaped by factors such as class, region, and religion, creating diverse experiences and challenges. Some women found spaces for expression and influence within convents or courts, while others endured hardship and marginalization. Overall, medieval gender roles and sexuality reveal a complex interplay of power, identity, and resistance, illuminating the human dimensions behind historical structures and norms. The intimate relationship between medieval sexuality and legal systems reveals a complex tapestry of norms, sanctions, and protections, reflecting society's efforts to regulate behavior and maintain order amid human desires and social imperatives. Laws concerning sexual conduct ranged from canon law imposed by the church to secular statutes enforced by local lords and communities, creating overlapping jurisdictions that sometimes conflicted but together shaped the lived experience of medieval men and women. Canon law, derived from religious doctrine, was particularly concerned with defining moral boundaries. It prohibited adultery, fornication, incest, and sodomy, prescribing penances and spiritual penalties for transgressors. Marriage was regulated strictly, with rules about consanguinity and the necessity of consent emphasizing the sacramental nature of the union. Clergy held tribunals that dealt with cases of sexual misconduct among the faithful, intertwining spiritual authority with social governance. Secular law addressed sexual offenses with a focus on social stability and property rights. Adultery, especially when committed by women, was seen as a threat to lineage and inheritance, often punished harshly. Rape was treated as a crime against a woman's family or community, with penalties that could include fines, exile, or corporal punishment, though justice was uneven and influenced by status. Prostitution was regulated variably, sometimes tolerated as a necessary evil, sometimes persecuted. Legal procedures involved community participation, with neighbors acting as witnesses or jurors, reflecting the collective investment in sexual morality. Trials could be public spectacles, reinforcing norms through example and deterrence. Yet, social connections and wealth often influenced outcomes, revealing inequalities in the administration of justice. Marriage disputes, including accusations of impotence, non-consummation, or infidelity, were common grounds for legal action. Annulments required proving canonical impediments, reflecting the seriousness with which marriage vows were regarded. Women sometimes used legal means to assert rights or seek separation, though options were limited. The interplay of law and custom created a dynamic environment where sexual behavior was continually negotiated. Folk traditions, local variations, and individual circumstances shaped how laws were applied and experienced. Communities balanced the need for order with compassion, creating mechanisms for both punishment and reconciliation. Through these legal frameworks, medieval society sought to channel human sexuality into forms deemed acceptable, protecting property, honor, and social cohesion. The complexities and contradictions inherent in these systems illuminate the challenges of governing desire in a world defined by overlapping authorities and values. The influence of literature and poetry on medieval conceptions of sex and love cannot be overstated. These art forms functioned as powerful vehicles for expressing complex emotions, social ideals, and cultural anxieties surrounding intimacy. From the lofty verses of troubadours to the bawdy tales recited in taverns, medieval storytelling captured a spectrum of human experience that both mirrored and shaped societal attitudes. Courtly love poetry, flourishing in the courts of southern France and spreading throughout Europe, portrayed love as a noble pursuit marked by longing, admiration from afar, and sometimes unrequited desire. This idealized love emphasized virtues such as patience, loyalty, and spiritual refinement, often in tension with the realities of arranged marriages and political alliances. The poetry employed intricate symbolism and metaphor, allowing poets to explore forbidden or difficult feelings within socially acceptable frameworks. Conversely, popular literature and folklore included ribald humor, satire, and frank depictions of sexual exploits. Collections like the Fabliau's short, comic tales often focused on trickery and lust, offered candid portrayals of human folly and desire, using humor to critique social norms and authority figures. These stories circulated widely, reflecting a popular appetite for entertainment that confronted taboos with wit and irreverence. Religious writings and mystical poetry also engaged with themes of love and union, sometimes employing erotic imagery to describe spiritual experiences. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen and later mystics used the language of passion and desire to articulate the soul's relationship with the divine, blending corporeal and spiritual longing in ways that challenged strict dichotomies. Drama and theatrical performances brought stories of love, betrayal, and sexual politics to public audiences, using humor, allegory, and spectacle to explore human relationships. Mystery plays and morality dramas often depicted the consequences of lust and virtue, reinforcing moral lessons while engaging viewers emotionally. Manuscripts and illuminated texts combined visual and verbal elements to convey layered meanings about love and sex, using iconography and calligraphy to enhance interpretation. The interplay of image and word created a rich, multisensory cultural experience. Through these diverse literary forms, medieval culture engaged deeply with the complexities of sexuality, offering audiences means to reflect, critique, and celebrate the many facets of human intimacy. The enduring power of these works testifies to their central role in shaping the medieval imagination and social life. The culinary culture of the medieval world was intricately connected to sexuality and courtship, with food serving as both sustenance and symbol in the intimate lives of individuals and communities. Banquets, feasts, and everyday meals reflected not only social status but also beliefs about the body, health, and desire, intertwining gastronomy with the pleasures and rituals of love. Certain foods were believed to possess aphrodisiac properties, thought to stimulate passion, enhance fertility, or balance bodily humors associated with vitality. Ingredients such as oysters, almonds, figs, and honey were prized for their reputed effects, often incorporated into dishes served at weddings or romantic encounters. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and saffron, expensive and exotic, added both flavor and symbolic value, evoking warmth and excitement. Feasts provided opportunities for display and connection, where hosts demonstrated wealth and generosity while guests engaged in social bonding. The choreography of seating, serving, and consumption mirrored hierarchies and relationships, with shared meals reinforcing alliances, courtship, or family ties. Eating together was a physical and social act that embodied unity and trust. Medieval cookbooks, though rare, offer glimpses into the preparation of dishes associated with love and celebration. Recipes combined ingredients with symbolic meanings, creating culinary experiences designed to delight senses and stir emotions. The act of feeding or being fed was itself an intimate gesture, laden with cultural resonance. Food taboos and fasting periods influenced sexual behavior, reflecting religious discipline and health beliefs. Abstinence from certain foods was linked to controlling desires or preparing for spiritual activities. These practices demonstrated the interconnectedness of diet, body, and morality. In everyday life, the rhythms of work, harvest, and family shaped access to food and the timing of meals, which in turn affected energy and availability for intimacy. The communal aspects of cooking and eating fostered cooperation and care within households. Ultimately, the medieval table was a space where nourishment and desire met, reflecting the physical and symbolic sustenance essential to human connection. Understanding these culinary dimensions enriches our picture of medieval sexuality as a lived and sensorial experience. The final dimension to consider in understanding medieval sexuality is the role of death, disease, and the body's vulnerability, which profoundly influenced attitudes toward intimacy, health, and morality. In an era marked by frequent epidemics, limited medical knowledge, and high mortality rates, the body was both a source of desire and a site of fear, shaping how people approached sex and relationships. Plague, leprosy, and other contagious diseases cast long shadows over communities, provoking anxieties about contagion and purity. Sexual contact was sometimes implicated in the spread of illness, leading to moral judgments and social exclusion. The body's physical fragility heightened the stakes of intimate encounters, intertwining pleasure with risk. Religious teachings emphasize the transient nature of life and the importance of spiritual preparation for death, influencing sexual behavior through calls for chastity, confession, and repentance. The tension between earthly desires and eternal salvation created a moral framework that shaped personal and communal choices. Medical knowledge, rooted in humoral theory and observation, guided practices related to sexual health. Treatments aimed at balancing bodily fluids sought to prevent infertility, maintain vigor, and address ailments thought to arise from sexual excess or deficiency. The intersection of medicine, religion, and superstition created a complex landscape for managing the body's needs and vulnerabilities. Funerary rituals and beliefs about the afterlife also affected perceptions of the body and sexuality. The body was seen as both temple and temporary vessel, deserving respect even as it decayed. Sexuality, as a force of life, stood in poignant contrast to death's inevitability, highlighting the fragile beauty of human existence. In art and literature, motifs of mortality and desire often intertwined, reminding audiences of life's fleeting pleasures and the enduring quest for meaning. These themes resonated deeply, reflecting the human condition in all its complexity. Thus, medieval sexuality cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the ever-present reality of death and the body's precariousness. This awareness shaped not only practices and beliefs, but also the emotional textures of love, fear, and hope that defined intimate life. Beyond the daily realities of medieval life, the broader cultural exchanges across continents deeply influenced ideas about sexuality, love, and the body. Trade routes stretching from Europe to Asia and the Middle East brought not only goods but also philosophies, medical knowledge, and artistic expressions that enriched and complicated European understandings of intimacy. Arabic and Persian medical texts, translated into Latin, introduced new concepts about human anatomy, reproductive health, and treatments for sexual dysfunction, blending empirical observation with mystical elements. Physicians like Avicenna and Al-Razi were studied in European universities, shaping medical practice and influencing societal attitudes toward sexuality and health. Exotic spices, perfumes, and fabrics arriving through trade carried sensual associations, enhancing the rituals of courtship and pleasure. The allure of the Orient, often romanticized in literature and art, added layers of fantasy and desire to European imaginations, reflecting both fascination and apprehension. Philosophical and theological exchanges also enriched debates about the nature of love, the soul, and the body. Concepts from Aristotelian and Neoplatonic thought were integrated with Christian doctrine, creating nuanced frameworks that sought to reconcile reason, faith, and passion. Cultural hybridity manifested in music, poetry, and visual arts, where motifs and styles crossed boundaries, fostering creativity and new modes of expression. This cross-pollination underscored the interconnectedness of human experience and the shared quest to understand desire and intimacy. However, these exchanges also sparked tensions, as unfamiliar customs and beliefs challenged established norms, prompting both acceptance and resistance. The negotiation of these influences contributed to the dynamic evolution of medieval sexuality, reflecting a world in flux. Recognizing the global dimensions of medieval sexual culture enriches our appreciation of its complexity, revealing a tapestry woven from diverse threads that shaped personal and collective identities across time and space. The profound influence of medieval pilgrimage on sexuality, intimacy, and social relations represents a fascinating convergence of spirituality, mobility, and human desire, revealing how journeys to sacred sites reshaped personal experiences and communal bonds across Europe and beyond. Pilgrimage was not merely a religious obligation or act of penance, but a transformative voyage that intersected with myriad aspects of medieval life, including the realms of love, sex, and social interaction. Pilgrims traveled vast distances to destinations such as Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, and Rome, often undertaking arduous routes that span months or years, during which they encountered diverse peoples, customs, and challenges. The physical hardships of travel, combined with the shared purpose of spiritual devotion, fostered intense camaraderie and sometimes intimate relationships among fellow travelers who found in each other sources of comfort, companionship, or passion. The pilgrimage context created liminal spaces, both literal and metaphorical, where normal social rules could be relaxed or reinterpreted. Away from the watchful eyes of family, village, or court, individuals navigated newfound freedoms and risks, balancing vows of chastity with the reality of human desire. Tales and records suggest encounters ranging from fleeting flirtations to lasting unions born on the road, illustrating the complex interplay of restraint and indulgence. Sacred sites themselves became focal points for ritualized expressions of love and fertility. Many shrines were associated with miracles of conception or healing, attracting couples seeking blessings for fertility or protection. The exchange of tokens, vows, and prayers at these holy places imbued intimate relationships with spiritual significance, merging earthly passion with divine grace. Pilgrimage also influenced local economies and social structures. The influx of travelers created opportunities for hospitality, commerce, and entertainment, including taverns and inns where social and sometimes sexual exchanges occurred. These venues became spaces where social hierarchies could be momentarily blurred, enabling interactions across class and cultural lines that might otherwise have been constrained. Moreover, pilgrimage narratives and literature often incorporated themes of love, temptation, and moral testing, using the journey motif to explore the soul's path toward purity amid worldly challenges. These stories reflected broader societal anxieties and hopes, emphasizing the transformative potential of travel and devotion. In addition, the experience of pilgrimage could serve as a catalyst for personal reflection and change, prompting individuals to reconsider their relationships, behaviors, and spiritual commitments. For some, the journey marked a turning point, leading to marriages, conversions, or renewed vows of celibacy. Thus, pilgrimage emerges as a multifaceted phenomenon deeply intertwined with medieval sexuality, illuminating how movement, faith, and human connection converge to shape intimate lives in ways both sacred and secular. The roads to the holy sites were not merely paths of piety but corridors of human experience, where the complexities of desire and devotion walked side by side. Amidst the intertwined forces of faith, power, and human desire, the world of medieval sexuality was also profoundly shaped by the voices and experiences of children and adolescents, a demographic often overlooked yet vital to understanding the rhythms of love, learning, and socialization. Childhood in the Middle Ages was a time of gradual initiation into the customs and expectations of adult life, where notions of innocence, curiosity, and vulnerability mingled with the pressing realities of survival and duty. From a young age, children absorbed the lessons of their communities, internalizing values related to chastity, marriage, and gender roles through family instruction, religious education, and social observation. Stories, songs, and rituals served as vehicles for transmitting norms, blending entertainment with moral teaching. The gradual awakening of sexual awareness was navigated within frameworks that emphasized modesty, obedience, and preparation for the responsibilities ahead. Adolescents, particularly in noble and urban settings, experienced more structured courtships and arranged marriages, often beginning their social lives through supervised interactions that balance protection with exposure to potential partners. Education in etiquette, religion, and household management prepared them for adult roles, while informal peer relationships allowed for exploration and the negotiation of identity. For peasants and lower classes, the transition to adulthood was often accelerated by economic necessity and labor demands, with young people contributing to household work, apprenticeships, or service. Their experiences of sexuality and intimacy were shaped by these practical constraints, as well as by communal norms and pressures. The Church's teachings emphasized the preservation of purity before marriage, promoting celibacy and chastity through sermons, confessions, and penitential practices. Violations could lead to social sanctions or spiritual penance, yet the realities of adolescent curiosity and desire were recognized, albeit often framed as moral challenges to be overcome. Literature and folklore portrayed youth both as innocent and as sources of temptation or folly, reflecting societal ambivalence toward emerging sexuality. Tales of tragic love, forbidden passion, and moral testing highlighted the vulnerabilities and potentialities of this life stage. Childbirth among teenage brides, common in noble circles due to early marriage, carried significant health risks, underscoring the intersection of biology and social expectation. Midwives and family members played critical roles in guiding young women through these transitions, blending practical care with spiritual support. Peer groups, festivals, and communal gatherings provided spaces where youthful energy and desire could be expressed within socially sanctioned bounds. Dancing, games, and courtship rituals allowed for interaction and flirtation, nurturing social bonds and potential romantic connections. Understanding the experiences of children and adolescents in medieval sexuality enriches the broader picture by highlighting processes of education, initiation, and negotiation that shaped the intimate lives of individuals and communities, revealing the ongoing human story of growth, desire, and belonging. The intricate connection between medieval sexuality and the visual arts illuminates a realm where desire, morality, and social commentary were communicated through images that adorned churches, manuscripts, and private spaces. Far beyond mere decoration, these artworks embodied complex narratives and symbolisms, inviting viewers to reflect on the profound tensions between flesh and spirit, temptation and virtue. Cathedral sculptures often portrayed biblical scenes laden with sexual symbolism, such as the temptation of Adam and Eve, the sin of lust, or the virtues of chastity and fidelity. Gargoyles and grotesques, perched high above, sometimes embodied caricatures of human vice, their exaggerated forms serving as cautionary reminders of moral dangers lurking both outside and within the sacred space. Illuminated manuscripts combined intricate calligraphy with marginalia, playful or subversive images drawn in the margins, that sometimes included erotic or humorous depictions. These subtle visual jokes and allegories revealed the artist's wit and the culture's capacity to engage with sexuality in ways that balanced reverence and irreverence. Private devotional objects and household items featured motifs that symbolized fertility, love, or protection. Embroidered textiles, carved furniture, and painted ceramics incorporated patterns such as hearts, flowers, or mythical creatures, blending aesthetic pleasure with spiritual and social meanings. These objects became part of daily life, embedding sexual symbolism into intimate environments. Paintings and frescoes often depicted saints and martyrs whose lives intertwined with themes of chastity, temptation, or divine love. The contrast between sacred purity and human frailty was a recurrent motif, inviting meditation on the soul's struggle amidst earthly desires. The patronage of art by nobility and clergy shaped the content and style of works, reflecting contemporary ideals and anxieties about sexuality. Commissioned pieces reinforced social hierarchies and moral lessons, yet also allowed for personal expression and the subtle negotiation of identity. Artistic representations served not only as mirrors of prevailing attitudes but also as agents influencing perceptions and behaviors, shaping how medieval people understood and experienced sexuality within their cultural context. By examining the visual language of the Middle Ages, we uncover a rich tapestry of meaning where desire, discipline, and devotion converge, revealing the enduring complexity of human intimacy. As we draw this journey through medieval sexuality to a close, it becomes clear that the intimate lives of people from centuries past were as intricate, dynamic, and profoundly human as our own. Far from the simplified or sensationalized versions often portrayed, medieval sexuality was woven into the fabric of everyday existence, shaped by the interplay of faith, culture, power, and personal desire in ways that resonate across time. From the rich symbolism embedded in art and literature to the lived realities of peasants and nobles, from the mystical ideals of courtly love to the pragmatic concerns of marriage and family, the Middle Ages reveal a world where sexuality was not merely an act but a multifaceted experience: physical, emotional, spiritual, and social. The tensions between restraint and expression, sin and sanctity, secrecy and celebration created a vibrant tapestry that continues to fascinate and inform. Understanding medieval sexuality requires us to embrace complexity and contradiction, to see beyond myths and stereotypes, and to appreciate the humanity of those who lived in a vastly different world, yet shared the same fundamental impulses. It invites us to reflect on how culture, belief, and circumstance shape our own experiences, and to recognize the enduring connections that link us to the past. So, as the echoes of history fade and the quiet settles, remember that the stories of love, desire, and intimacy are timeless. woven into the very essence of human life, inviting us to listen, learn, and perhaps find ourselves in the reflections of those who came before.